technical assistance. It was, of course, fitting to house the Institute at TC. As a graduate school of education, health, and psychology, Professor Gordon's holistic approach matched well with our historic commitment to pushing boundaries and conducting courageous inquiry. And it was a return home for Professor Gordon, who received his EDD in 1957. Let's see, we can calculate how long ago that was. Many years of stellar performance. So he graduated in 1957 from Teachers College. The Gordon Institute has led the way with remarkable scholarship and impact, working with faculty across the college and numerous community partners. Now, I think if you look at the program today, and you hear the history that we're going to hear in a few minutes, I think that's certainly borne out in the facts that have happened. So here are just a few of the things that have come out of this. Leading in the study of human diversity and pedagogy. Being a champion of supplementary and comprehensive education. A holistic approach that viewed all settings, the home, the school, houses of worship, and a range of community and social settings as theaters of learning. This is a foundation notion and philosophy of Teachers College. Leading the affirmative development of academic ability, helping to create the U.S. Department of Education's Resource Information Center, or ERIC, a vital source for research and information on programs supporting urban education and marginalized students. Examining equitable methods of assessment, researching Black male scholarship, focusing on the study of hip-hop and education, leading in youth participatory action research in urban education, developing equitable and culturally responsive approaches to science and mathematics education, documenting the history of mathematics and mathematics education by people of color, incubating the Black Education Research Center and the development of the Black Studies curriculum for New York City public schools, developing of the first curriculum with and about the Lenape people, conducting a critical rethinking of quantification, including measurement and statistical modeling, and developing cultural and critical theory of technology, including AI. I feel like I need to take a rest after going through all of the things. So I know there are other things you want to do today, so I actually can't go on and say all of the things, so I'll have to stop there. And in any case, today, these are all about the wonders of the past. Today, we want to talk about the future, so I want to leave time for that. So as TC continues to evolve to meet the changing needs of our fields in education, health, and psychology, and meeting the moment of what is arguably among the most challenging times of our history, the work of the Institute is as vital as it was in 1973, and I've said actually more vital. You'll hear a theme throughout the day's programming about radical transformation and, importantly, vision under the leadership of Professor Ezekiel Dixon-Román, who is bringing us to this stage of the Institute's development. Professor Dixon-Román was himself a student of Professor Gordon's grandchild, as he said, intellectual grandchild, and now not only carries forward his legacy, but is leading us in new important directions. There's a critical role for the Gordon Institute that must play in the world and at Teachers College. It is about addressing educational equity for racialized and socially precarious populations. It is about pushing boundaries, continuing the Institute's path-breaking legacy and field-defining scholarship, and continuing to lead with vision, insight, research, and yes, radical transformation as we consider the future of education. So again, I thank you for joining us here and welcome you to join us in this crucial work. We are fortunate to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you, President Bailey, for the kind words and for putting the foundation of YUME into the larger context of the reality of the day, and even reminding us of the very things that were going on, the historical moments, events, and even policy and legal decision-making that even was working in the backdrop to what made YUME so important at the time of its emergence. And of course, what continues to go on and what makes YUME so deeply important today. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, our own Barry Goldenberg, who will take us over the history of YUME as part of Teachers College history and the wider story of critical educational research. This keynote will explore this history by examining the 6 distinct eras of its existence, from its founding in 1973 by Professor Edmund W. Gordon to its recent years. Barry is a lecturer in the Education Sciences and MAT plus credential programs in the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine, and has received multiple recognitions for his teaching. His forthcoming book, Strength Through Diversity, Harlem Prep and the Rise of Multiculturalism, explores the history of a groundbreaking community school in Central Harlem during the Civil Rights era. His research on racial equity in schools and community-based history instruction has been published in Urban Education, Multicultural Perspectives, Rethinking History, Voices from the Middle, and the Social Studies. His latest article will be published in the Journal of African American History in spring 2024. He holds a BA in History from UCLA and an MA and PhD in History and Education from Teachers College, Columbia University. Barry, I think I am not speaking alone for myself when I say that it is a real pleasure to welcome you back to TC and to YUME. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. All right, can everybody hear me? A little bit more. Let's see here. It's on. Should I pump it up a bit more? How are we doing? Check. Okay. All right. Perfect. Well, I first want to say when I got the invitation to come today, I was just floored. I'm just so thankful and grateful. I want to thank, first of all, Professor Ezekiel Dixon-Román for the invitation and the YUME team. This is, without a doubt, the highlight of my professional career to be here. You know, I was working with YUME from 2011 to 2019. I remember I was always in the back recording things and taking pictures and running the social media, and now I'm here in front speaking. It is a powerful full circle moment, and to hear your words and talk about my work, it really moves me beyond what I can express. So I just want to say thank you for the invitation. I don't take it lightly to be here in front of Dr. Gordon, the founder of YUME, whose work and whose humanity I admire more than you'll ever know, and we all, of course, will ever know. It means the world to me. So I know you came here to learn about YUME, not that, but I just want to really say thank you so much. And so I also want to thank Angela Gooden as well for a lot of the stuff you're going to see up there. Angela helped me put together. So, when I was thinking about today's talk, I'm going to walk around if that's okay, and thinking about YUME's history, I was reading the promotional, like the marketing materials, and it said, travel through YUME's history. I was like, you know what? I'm going to take that literally. Let's actually travel through YUME's history together. 50 years and 30, 40 minutes. It's going to be concise, but I'll do my very best. Because there's so much to share. And I know you're going to hear so much today from so many brilliant and beautiful speakers about what YUME has done and the meaning of YUME, the power of YUME, the essence of YUME, who can speak about YUME in ways that I cannot. But as a historian, I hope I can bring some perspective of what YUME has done the last 50 years, just an overview, and then later on you're going to hear, of course, where YUME will be going. Right. So without further ado, we got 50 years to travel through, so we will start. See if this works here. So this is the history of YUME, right? 50 years of pursuing educational equity and building community in Harlem and beyond. And so we have a timeline, and we're going to go through this timeline together. And where any timeline starts is obviously at the founding, right? And I know President Bailey went over a little bit what's happening in 73. So think about that context. And we have our founding right here, right? So it's March 30th, 1973. It's Zoom back there, right? And Teachers College puts out a press release, right? Dr. Gordon held a joint appointment at Teachers College as well as the Educational Testing Service, or ETS. And so there's a partnership TC was working with there. And you can see the press release. You can see at the top here, Dr. Edmund W. Gordon, Professor of Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. If you look at the second paragraph, the Institute will specialize in research, development, training, and service programs designed to improve education in the nation's cities, right? And TC was beginning to do that work. ETS was doing that work. But this institute, it would coordinate, and you see at the bottom, expand these efforts, right? Expand these efforts. And there was an urgent need, a huge urgent need. As far as I was able to research and find, no other institutions had centers dedicated to students of color in 1973. And so YUME was the first. And also, YUME and ETS initially reached out to our federal government to say, hey, can you work with us? Can you sponsor us? Can you provide funding? And initially, the National Institute of Education, which was then under the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, they'd actually declined to support this partnership because they said, we don't need a separate institute to support marginalized students. And so, again, there is an urgent need for the work of YUME and what YUME was going to do and has been doing for 50 years, right? So that's the context. And so as Dr. Gordon and his colleagues were thinking about what is YUME going to be, who are they going to be, what are they going to look at, what are we going to explore, right? There are really three main concepts that they were thinking about. And before I get into that, I love the old YUME logo from the archives. We dug that up. Thank you, Angela. And Dr. Gordon's signature in the end of that. Right, so there's really three main concepts that they were thinking about at this time and what YUME would explore and just be about in these early planning committees, right? So first was the issue of diversity. The second was the issue of mobility. And third was the issue of rigidity. So first, again, take us back to 1973. It's a few months after YUME was founded. And there is some planning committees and some task force devising, again, what YUME would be about. So there was a document here. It's September of 73. This is kind of the plans for YUME, internal workings, internal documents, like 20 pages or so of what YUME should look at and all that kind of stuff, right? And so among that was the issue of diversity. YUME is going to explore the issue of diversity. And what does that mean, right? In terms of how they were defining it. Of course, in this space, we know what diversity means, although it's often co-opted to mean different things, right? So as Dr. Gordon and his colleagues wrote at the time, marginalized communities are, quote, considerably more varied with respect to population characteristics than much of the literature on the subject would lead us to believe, right? Thinking about today, thinking about 1973, right? Trying to push back and fight against the ignorant and the ridiculous stereotypes of homogenous communities, homogenous black communities, Latinx communities, right? That there is great diversity of our communities, right? And we need to study and focus and celebrate that diversity, right? And so this is the words of Dr. Gordon and YUME at the time. And so YUME would be dedicated to responding to the cultural and ethnic diversity in America's cities, right? In devising school practices that fostered, quote, this is from the report, learning experiences more reflective of the characteristics of the learning. Think about culturally responsive pedagogy, think about reality pedagogy, hip-hop pedagogy, right? This is what we're talking about 50 years ago. Dr. Gordon had the foresight to think about, okay, youth are brilliant, they are amazing, they are genius. Let's tap into that genius. Let's tap into their culture. Let's tap into their skill sets and their interests, right? So I love the forerunner and thinking about, YUME was already thinking about diversity in this, I think, progressive way, right? That's the first issue that YUME was talking about. Number two was this idea of mobility. Right? And so again, this is a snippet from the report, or from the document, right? And so, Dr. Gordon was asking this question, how does mobility, or lack thereof, quote, affect the way in which a child views his world, his history, his environment, her environment, their future, right? Important questions. And Dr. Gordon was thinking there's really two ways we should think about this idea of mobility, right? One, the idea of social mobility, right? Making sure students and families had the resources to be successful, to improve their lot in life through education and through schooling, which of course was not the case and is still often not the case, right? And second was this idea of spatial immobility, right? White flight is occurring, right? Feeling like families are unable to improve their lot, to have through education because of systemic racism and housing policy, that tight connection between housing and education, right? And so those are part of the concepts that YUME was thinking about at this time, right? And number three is this idea of rigidity. What does this mean, right? again from the report, there is this problem of how individuals and organizations maintain existing patterns and practices that then cause them to, quote from the report, resist change of direction and practices even in the face of new knowledge and skills, right? In other words, there's a problem. We have a problem here that we need to discard old ideas and determine, quote, how and when to replace them, right, when teaching marginalized youth. Get rid of the old. IUME has always been about, and we're going to see this here, and we know this still today, about pushing the envelope, right? Thinking outside the box, right? Doing new things that no one else is doing, right? That was happening in 73. We need to remove those old ideas about young people and change what we do that's focused on them and their genius, right? This also was in terms of higher education, right? Again, this is this link between community and higher education. And again, from the planning document 73, there was a desire to, IUME at the founding, quote, link the knowledge being developed by universities like Teachers College and institutes and research organizations like IUME with the knowledge being used by people in the everyday world, right? And so it's still something I think IUME strives to do to this day, right? So this is the founding. I spent a few extra minutes on it because I feel like we have to have that foundation, right? And as a historian, what we do is we look at scopes of time and we look for patterns and things that happen over time, right? And so as I spent time on this history, and it's part of like a 100-page report that I've worked on with a lot of great help, and as I've gone through IUME's history, I really found like 3 guiding principles, right? That were, no matter if we're talking about 73 or 83 or 2003, that were always present in what made IUME who IUME was, right? So these were present in every era. One was this idea of intergenerationality, right? Which I'm not sure is a word, but I think it should be. If it's not, is it a word? Perfect. We're adopting it, right? I love it. Number 2 is this idea of community, and 3 is this idea of praxis, right? So first, intergenerationality, right? So IUME has always been a pipeline for educational leadership, particularly for scholars of color. Dr. Gordon was fighting for more hiring in the 1970s for more scholars of color. There's been a deep investment in scholars at every stage of their career, and scholars who are interested in doing the work that IUME is interested in doing. And I certainly am grateful for the investment that IUME has had in me. I started as a work study student, as a master's student. For those who are out here, then became a research fellow at IUME, and now after I finished my PhD in 2019, I'm so grateful to have still association with IUME, right? So always investing in people through every stage of that career. So when you see light blue throughout this timeline, think about intergenerationality, right? Number 2 is this idea of community, right? A commitment to community engagement and a broader community uplift, right? IUME has always had a deep and genuine dedication to supporting the Harlem community. You'll see that all throughout the next 50 years through Orange. And then praxis, right? Partnering with K-12 schools, putting theory into practice, working directly with local schools to impact their teaching, to impact their policy, actually making a difference, right? When you see anything in green, think about praxis, right? So, to kind of sum up this early stage, and I'll go pretty concisely through these 6 eras, the goal of IUME was not only to understand challenges, but develop, quote, as Dr. Gordon said in 1973, not only to understand the challenges, but develop the formulation of systematic programs of research directed at their solution, right? Let's not just study all the things that are wrong. Let's study how we can make them better, right? I think that paradigm shift has been what has put IUME at the forefront of critical and radical research for the last 50 years, and will continue to do so, I know, for the next 50 more. So we have 6 eras here. I know, a lot to go through. I forgot to mention, I will try to leave a few minutes at the end for question and answer. Yeah, so shall we begin? So we have 1973. It's our first era. Titled, these are my own titles, so but from my themes, I believe, the early years of wisdom under the wisdom of Dr. Gordon, right? So this ran from about 73 to 1979, and after as President Bailey said, and after completing his doctorate at TC, when he started IUME in 73. He wasn't coming with a blank slate, right? There were so many projects that he was doing and bringing, right? Over 40 books and articles, right? And he brought those projects to Teachers College and to IUME, along with Dr. Erwin Flaxman, who is the associate director. I love this photo of Dr. Gordon, powerful as it is today, as it was then, right? And so he had a lot of projects. He brought projects around desegregation at the time, around public education and broadcasting materials to a wider audience, projects around test and curriculum development, developing the first college placement exam for African American history, curriculum and tests for preschoolers, for bilingual students, right? So it's beyond the scope to go into these details, but YUME was already a robust place in the early 70s because of the work that Dr. Gordon was doing at previously coming to Teachers College, right? But if we're thinking about what defines this first era, it was really government support, a lot of government support. And that was for the ERIC Clearinghouse on Urban Education, if we had to kind of funnel this era down. And what was the ERIC Clearinghouse on Urban Education? I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but if not, essentially, this was the most prominent and longest term supported activity of the Institute, as Dr. Gordon said in Reflection a couple of years ago. And so what this was, essentially, the National Institute of Education, which was then under the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, they contracted with YUME, right? I love the old logo here. And it served as basically a repository for all the research being done in urban education, right? So if you were a scholar and you were doing research on marginalized youth or black communities or bilingual education, you would tell YUME and submit your work there, and grad students would sift through it to make sure this was appropriate. And YUME was the hub. YUME was literally the physical place for all research on urban education across the country, right? And these reports were accessible to everybody, right? If you were a parent or a community member or a scholar, you'd come to YUME for a few dollars and you get to see the latest research in urban education, right? And because the YUME was this physical hub, the publications that were coming out of the Institute at this time were copious, right? So for one, they had the IRCD bulletins, I think the Information Retrieval Center on the Disadvantaged, that's what it was called at the time, published about 4 to 5 times per year. And by 76, they had a subscription base of 16,000. I know, like, with my articles, I hope that like 10 people read them, right? 15 if I'm lucky. 16,000, incredible reach that YUME was having. And these bulletins had everything from like debates in the field to like new research and scholarships and book reviews, right, on urban education that YUME was putting out. YUME also put out the Equal Opportunity Review. This was a shorter newsletter, about 10 per year, a couple pages long. And this anyone could contribute to. If you were a student, a TC faculty member or a TC student or a community member, submit your work to the EOR and you can share your voice. I think that's really powerful. And so we have some examples. 1976 right here. To our left, the Equal Opportunity Review, Toward an Understanding of Educational Equity by Dr. Gordon. And then to the right, the IRCD Bulletin of fall 1876. The left is from August. I love the center. This is on the back. This is on the back of every bulletin, right? Call for documents, submit your work, right? We want to hear your voice. So I love these. This is like the gold mine for historians, right? When we see these things. So by 1978, YUME was growing, and it was essentially organized into 5 organizational units. Okay, you had the General Assistance Center for Equal Educational Opportunity. You had the General Assistance Center on Bilingual Education, at the Ethnic Heritage Teacher Training Project, the Bilingual Multicultural Preschool Curriculum Development Project, and of course the ERIC Clearinghouse, of which I just mentioned, right? And so these were all centers that had their own projects, right? And so what's important to know for the scope of this overview is that these 4, this was praxis, right? Because these centers work directly with local school districts, right? To impact policy, to impact teaching, to make schools actually better, right? As Dr. Gordon talked about in the founding, and I failed to mention, right? There was a focus on action research, not just empirical research. So in kind of summing up, again, spending a little bit more time on this early era, the 1970s, right? By the end of this era, YUME really developed their three-prong approach, right? 1, research to get ideas and decide which ideas work, right? 2, feed those ideas into a later evaluation. And if the ideas work, disseminate those results to others. And as we can see, YUME's three-prong approach there. And this is in the words of Dr. Harrington, who was the associate director at the time and becomes a later director in one of the interviews that we conducted a few years ago. So this is our first era. We're going to slide on to our next era here. So new voices, continued initiatives, and growth at Teachers College, 1980 to about 1989. And speaking of new voices, Dr. Gordon, he leaves Teachers College, but he comes back, as you know, so don't, he comes back to TC and to YUME. But for now, he leaves Teachers College at the time, and there's a need for a second director, right? And among those new voices, our second director was Margaret Ross, Dr. Margaret Ross Barnett. And she came from Howard University. Previously, she was at Princeton University. And she was a political scientist by training, but she was very, very interdisciplinary. She was actually hired because of the interdisciplinary knowledge that she had. She served for a couple years until 1983. And she was an NAACP trustee. She was recognized as a up-and-coming rising black leader in a variety of magazines and outlets, right? So she was writing in a bunch of places, right? W.E.B. Du Bois's The Crisis magazine, she was talking about fighting against anti-blackness and popular representation. She really brought national acclaim to the Institute in terms of, again, expanding its voice. She was writing a lot in all of the elections, and so always mentioning Yumi, and so really, again, bringing a national recognition to the work of Yumi. And as far as I'm able to see, she was the first woman of color to lead a major institute. So again, Yumi's always been about first pushing the envelope, and her hiring, her work was a part of that, right? And in 1983, she leaves Yumi and she becomes a vice chancellor to the CUNY schools. And there is then a search for a third director, right? And this time, Yumi didn't go very far. They hired Dr. Charles Harrington, or Chuck Harrington, and he was Yumi's deputy director at the time, TC professor of anthropology. He succeeds Barnett, and he continued a lot of the initiatives that she started in the early 80s. For example, particularly around bilingual programs, because that was a lot of his work in anthropology. He continued the bilingual Head Start curriculum program, an annual colloquium on Hispanic issues, which I think is notable, right? Thinking widely about marginalized youth and marginalized communities, right? Not just black communities, but also Latinx communities and others, and we're going to see throughout this presentation, right? So that was really important to see in the 1980s. 1984, as an example of this, there was also a lot of collaborations happening in the 80s. We see a lot of collaborations with TC faculty, right? So for example, there's a partnership with Professor Leslie Williams, and there is a really well-known book that came out. I think this book is actually it's there, Angela, you have it. It's in the timeline, so go check out in Everett, that looked at the linguistic inclusiveness of young learners, right, before it became a popular line of research today. And so again, an example, this book was an outgrowth of the work that was being done at Yumi, and so again, a lot of important initiatives. Those initiatives include the New York City Dropout Prevention Initiative. So for example, Yumi was working directly with the Office of the Mayor to help evaluate why and how to prevent students who are being pushed out of the school systems, right? And so the Office of the Mayor called on Yumi to do that kind of work. And I think that speaks to the type of praxis that Yumi was doing, right? Working directly with school districts and directly with those in charge to try to impact policy and teaching, right? We also see community, right? There's our orange and green colors, right? I love this flyer. Folklore, folk life, and classroom, tapping the oral traditions. This was a community event. This was actually an advertisement in the Columbia Spectator, which is the undergraduate magazine, right? And so come to Yumi, learn about how to do oral history methodology, how to interview your elders, record those beautiful, important, those sacred narratives. Come to Yumi, we'll help you train that. Reminds me of some of the great work being done today around oral history. And really, really, really cool. Speaks to the work that Yumi was doing to always still invest in the community in which they are not just researching on, but hopefully researching with, right, together. The third kind of column I have here is growth at TC, right? So by the end of this decade, it was, and this was Dr. Gordon's own retelling of history back in 2008, quote, the largest research and development unit of the college with an annual funding exceeding $9.1 million in today's dollars. A lot of money, right? That's how much work Yumi was doing, how supported it was, and that speaks to the growth of the Institute by the end of that decade. And so this was from the report that I've been working on. And so what I'm saying here is that this era is really defined by collaborations a bit. We see the growth of collaborations and growth of Yumi more broadly. And this was, as Dr. Harrington said in one of his interviews, he was saying how Yumi had their own sets of students, but they also employed students all across the college, right? He was saying how we had 70 people, including many graduate students, on staff at one point that he remembered. It was when all the projects were running full tilt, it was a busy place, right? So we see Yumi being a busy place in this era, right? And don't forget, federal funding is fading away. This is the Reagan administration, right, who tried to do away with the Department of Education. Didn't happen, of course, but federal funding, that type of support that we saw in the previous decade was not as copious as it was before. And the focus of Yumi really says we're going to grow inward. We're going to really grow at Teachers College, have our imprint in all different departments and make waves in that way. So that really becomes the focus of TC at that time. And also want to highlight intergenerationality, right? Dr. Harrington, who had been with Yumi, knew the work of Dr. Gordon, taking over and leading the Institute during these years. So we'll skip ahead to the next era here. And I title it City Partnerships and a Focus on New York City Schools. And so Dr. Harrington, he steps down as UME director. He still stays around. He wanted to pursue some other writing projects. And in 89 to 95 is this next era. And it becomes these 2 years, 89, 91, more of a transition period, okay? So from 89 to 91, UME has 2 co-directors, Dr. Joseph C. Granis and Dr. Dorothy Strickland. Dr. Granis, he did a lot of work around wraparound services, the ways in which social services are important for young people to be successful, right? Working with United Way, working with public schools, right? Dr. Strickland was a renowned advocate of equitable literacy instruction. They worked together a lot, and one of the things that they had in common, looking green here, they both had connections to New York City schools. They were working with New York City schools, and both of them recently passed away the last couple of years, so I'm glad that we're able to honor their work and their legacy with UME and the work that they did. So those connections with New York City schools are really important. But in 91, there is a search for a national search for a new director. See the flag there, and that ends with UME's 6th director, Dr. Francisco Rivera Batiz. And I know Dr. Bailey mentioned him, in the 1990s. And he was an economist by training, but also did a lot of work around education, was previously at Rutgers University, comes to Teachers College. In his interview, he was talking about New York as the center of education and really excited. And he really focuses on working with New York City schools. And so, for example, for that focus with New York City schools in 92, there is a commission that is housed at UME, chaired by the New York City Schools Chancellor, right? So the highest people in the city are working with UME to conduct longitudinal research on Latino students' motivation and school interest. And so here is this report towards a vision for the education of Latino students, community voices, student voices, right? And if I zoom in here, this is like from the second page of the report, right? The commission is fortunate to be housed at Teachers College Columbia University. You see this highlighted section in this first paragraph here. See if I can do the pointer. Thank you to teachers at UME for their day-to-day assistance and support. And I want to pay attention to the third paragraph here. And it says, finally, we would like to warmly thank the compañeros and compañeras who provided us with crucial moral support throughout this process. This report is dedicated to the Latino youth of New York City. In their eyes lies the vision for which we strive. I don't know who wrote that, but it sounds like UME, right? Pushing the city to recognize the brilliance of our young people, that everything we do is for them and for their purpose and in the communities in which we are serving, right? And so I think that speaks volumes about the type of work that UME was doing with the city, but pushing the city to think about youth in progressive and not regressive ways, right? Another commission at UME in 1994 is an example of the work being done with New York City schools. Again, a commission chaired by New York City Schools Chancellor about the impact of growing enrollment, right? New York City is growing, more kids are in classrooms. How is that going to affect teaching and policy? And who does New York City call on? They called on UME to help with this research, right? Bursting at the seams. And if I zoom in here to the right, you're going to see the work of the commission was coordinated by the staff at the Institute for Urban and Minority Education at Teachers College, right? And there were all the New York City leaders, board members, right? UME was who was in charge of that, right? And there's just thanking the leaders of UME. So again, examples of the type of work that UME was doing. I think it's praxis in terms of partnering with local schools or partnering with the people who impact local schools, right? Really trying to put theory to practice. What are the research we're doing and how can it change what the school system is doing? I think that's really important to note. And by this time, by the mid-90s, UME really had 4 main divisions, all right? And each division had their own director. So UME was robust. You had the research division, that was the one headed by the new director, Francisco Rivera Batiz. You had the division of evaluation studies by Dr. Granis. You had the professional development and educational services division. I want to spend just directed by Marietta Saravia Shore. She was associate director at the time. I want to spend a moment on this because I love the community flyers and pamphlets, right? So teaching foreign languages to young students. This was a 2-week summer institute where if you're a teacher in New York City, come to UME, come to Teachers College, learn about how to think about bilingualism and multilingualism. What was cool about this, it wasn't just only teachers who were in language. If you're a math teacher or a science teacher, come think about bilingualism in that way. And so that was explicit in the flyer, right? Which is really, really cool. It reminds me of Resi a little bit, right, in terms of a somewhere institute. So YUME has always been about serving teachers and trying to make education better for our youth. That's our community, that's our orange, right? You're seeing the pattern here. You'll keep seeing this orange pop up in the minutes to come. So, and then you also, of course, have the dissemination division led by Dr. Flaxman. Again, the Eric Center was still the most recognizable and largest division at YUME at the time, the most, quote, significantly funded, federal funded project YUME procured. Right? So this is kind of how to think about YUME here in the mid-90s. And in reflection, when we interviewed Dr. Rivera-Batiz, he was thinking about YUME. And he said, like, it was a big undertaking. He was like a chief manager. It was a very impressive institution. And, and he was also saying, and this is the second part of this quote here, that most of the children in New York City schools and other urban school systems are minority children, are students of color, right? And so YUME should be the center of research. It should be the center of Teachers College, center of work being done in New York City because of who we are serving, what we have always served, right? And so I think that speaks to the work that they were doing and the work that we continue to do, right? So Dr. Rivera-Batiz, he leaves YUME. He stays at Columbia to pursue other opportunities at SEPA. And there is a search for a new director. And this begins in 1995. And I'm terming this era consistent, it's a long era, consistent growth and familiarity in the new millennium. Or I guess into the new millennium, right? We're not quite there yet. We're close in 95. So this time, YUME did not go far. YUME Associate Director, Dr. Erwin Flaxman, he had been with YUME since its founding, was a co-founder of the Institute with Dr. Gordon. He becomes the director in 1995, and obviously very familiar with YUME. He had been running ERIC for decades now. And I want to recognize the intergenerationality again, turning to people who know the work of YUME, who support the work of YUME, supporting him all throughout his career. And ERIC Clearinghouse was the biggest thing that was happening in the 1990s still. And I love this here because now we're in the age of the internet. There we go, the early YUME webpage. Look at that, 1998. I love it. It's like a barn, I guess, in the city. I love the imagery, right? Pictures show a lot of things, right? That was the clearinghouse. All the documents are in that barn and they're glowing now. Didn't prepare that part, no. So at this time, by the early 2000s, there were 5 different series that YUME was putting out through the clearinghouse, right? They had the Urban Diversity series. This was the heart of ERIC, right? Monographs, the research reports, they'd be through the UDS. Then you had the Trends and Issues series. These were, again, more like broader debates in the field, panels discussing things, broader sociological issues happening. There was the ERIC Digest. These were like short 3-4 page digests of kind of like research reviews, summaries of almost the big monographs. Then you also had parent guides. These were documents that were specifically given out to parents and to schools to provide tips for students and young people and families that YUME was always being a part of. And then you had a bibliography section and directories to learn more, right? So I love the image, right? We've come a long way. The website looks beautiful. But there are other things happening at YUME, of course, at the time as well. 1999, on the heels of the Columbine shooting, right, in Colorado. What does YUME do? They always respond to things happening in the world, crises happening among our young people. And that was certainly true in the early 2000s, right? So YUME led, Dr. Flaxman led, a Choices in Preventing Youth Violence initiative. This was essentially kind of a 3-year project around youth violence, and a lot of stuff was happening. In 2000, they put out like a choices brief. It was like a discussion around conflict resolution in schools that parents and folks can read about. In 2001, there was an 83-page report that YUME put out around research to combat school violence. And Dr. Flaxman was very clear that there's so much conjecture of what we should do and what we shouldn't do. Here's the research. This is what the research says about how to prevent school violence. And it's not as apocalyptic as you hear, and youth are really resilient and they're brilliant, and all these sorts of things are part of this report and what they're putting out. 2001, YUME co-sponsors a conference on youth violence in schools about, again, how to improve upon the issues we're seeing and ways to value kids. And in 2002, YUME receives about a $500,000 grant to think about anti-violence prevention programs in New York City. Again, speaking of the work that YUME is doing and responding to what's happening in the world. And that has always been what YUME has been about, right? But we see the return of our illustrious founder, Dr. Gordon. In the 2001-2002 school year, Dr. Flaxman returns as the associate director level, and Dr. Gordon returns to UME at this time in his sage and ever vigilant years in the 80s, right? Brings a renewed energy and excitement to UME during his second stint, right? And which is super exciting for the Institute. And he serves until about 2011. And among the many, many things in which he brought to UME was national programs. Again, this is on the heels of No Child Left Behind, so there's pushback against that, but also more data to disaggregate, right? And so pushing back against the deficit narratives of children. That was one of the most important initiatives as an institute that Dr. Gordon was making sure not just to bring, but to keep building on, because UME's been doing that since its founding, right? And so, for example, digging into the archives, thinking about we have to remember that youth are brilliant and to build on that brilliance, right? These anti-deficit narratives are really important. And so, for example, among the many programs is the affirmative development of academic abilities programs. And again, think about what we read in 73, looking at exploring successful academic programs to, quote, investigate what works, elucidate new knowledge, and, quote, discover solutions. Always being about solutions, not just saying so-and-so doesn't work or so-and-so can't learn all these negative and deficit ideas and paradigms. No, let's look at solutions. Let's see what does work. Let's codify that. Let's write that down and share what works. That makes our youth so genius, right? And this is, again, from the early websites. Here we go, right? The correlates of high academic achievement, an example of this type of project, right? There we go. I don't think that UME office number is still accurate. But you see here at the second, it's highlighted, a little hard to see. So you can, in addition, it says, instead of trying to identify the obstacles to achievement, right, it will look for phenomena that bring about achievement, right? Let's see why youth are succeeding. What makes them so brilliant and smart and critical thinkers, right? And let's talk about this, write that down, let's codify that, right? And that's the research that UME was doing at that moment, as it always has been done, and that Dr. Gordon brought in his return to Teachers College during these years. But something big does happen that does begin to shift the Institute's focus a bit, and that was actually the disbandment of the ERIC Clearinghouse. So in 2004, ERIC disbands, and that was disbanded by the Department of Education in 2004 under the George Bush administration. Essentially, without going into a longer story, different universities had separate clearinghouses for different subjects. TC was for urban education, and they were the first, obviously. But at that time, the Department of Education says, we don't want that. Let's just all have, not certain subjects, but we'll just house everything under one banner. And so if you go to eric.gov today, it's all under one place. And also, it moves to all virtual, all electronic. Microfiche was being phased out, papers being phased out. So that's what happened there. Longer story, but for the sake of discussion, this is a big part of UME's history, right? And now it's no longer the case. And so as a result, I guess this is the aughts, right? I always get the decades. So in the 2000s, we really see UME growing a further imprint in in Harlem, right? Now that national initiative is no longer part of UME, or part of any institution. And as an outgrowth of ERIC, I'm assuming this is CERIC, right? Is that how you would say it, right? So this was led by Dr. Flaxman. So ERIC is no more, but UME starts and founds the Center for Information and Resources on Education and Community. And I love a pamphlet here. This is the Supplementary Education Expo 2005. This was, you can't see it here, but let's see here. These are like all different community organizations in Harlem. So it was inviting parents and community members to come to this expo, and there's free services and work be done in the community that can provide services for you. And this center, led by Dr. Flaxman, it explicitly served parents and communities in New York City, in Harlem, in Washington Heights, and the Upper West Side of Manhattan, all right? And this is awesome, right? Community members could come visit UME anytime between 9 to 5. They can make an appointment. UME would provide referrals, technology training, printing services to people in the community. So again, thinking about community, UME has always been about serving the community, and I think this is a powerful testament to that. When ERIC was disbanded, let's find other ways to disseminate information and work with those who need the information, deserve the information, right? To remember that link between community and Teachers College and UME, right, since its founding. And thinking of community, a big event happens. UME actually leaves the main campus of Teachers College in 2006 to then have a another campus in Harlem on 125th Street. So this was in the famous Hotel Teresa, now the Teresa Tower office buildings. And here it is. I never thought, so I was in this office. I never thought when I took this picture 13 years ago, 13 years ago or so, that I would be in a presentation. So thankfully I did. This was the sign when you walked in. If it's crooked, it's because of my photography back then wasn't so good. Still probably isn't so good, right? But yeah, this was the sign. So Yumi is no longer at Teachers College main campus, and they have their own 8th floor at the Teresa Tower on 125th and Adam Clayton Powell. And at the time, this was an enormous undertaking, right? Now Yumi is going to be literally in the community. And as the vice president of TC said at that time, right? Quote, "The importance of Teachers College having a true presence in Harlem cannot be overstated," right? To solve issues of educational equity on a national scale, we must first address them here in our own community. The Edmund W. Gordon campus is walking that talk, right? Yumi has always been about walking that talk, and we certainly see that here in 2006, right? So Yumi has now literally embedded itself in the community, serving the community, and there is a host of community programs that happen as a result. Not that there hasn't been before, but even more. In community programs, again, specifically in Harlem. In part, that is because of the hiring of Veronica Hiley. She's a senior program associate in 2004, gets promoted to assistant director in 2007. And for anyone who has been associated with Yumi in any capacity, she has long been the heart of Yumi, the heart and soul of the Institute. I certainly wouldn't be here without her. She provides her love and her guidance to graduate students and to the community in which she is a part of, has long been a part of, and has long been serving. And so she leads a host of community programs at Teachers College in the Gordon campus, tons of after-school programs, mentorship programs, coaching programs, working with community organizations, working with young people, working with parents and teachers. One of those community programs is the Harlem AIDS Blanket. And again, I have the blue heart because intergenerationality, 2 decades of work with Yumi and a mentee of Dr. Gordon. One of those programs, the Harlem AIDS Blanket Project, I worked on this about 15 years ago or so, 10 years ago. And this was her and Yumi staff going into the community and providing a HIV/AIDS awareness project in schools. And it was an art project, and students would make collages. It was really powerful. It was as emotionally resonant as it was informational. And the Columbia Spectator was talking about this project in schools all across New York City, and particularly in Harlem. And as Veronica said at the time, this project provided the support to the whole community. It was what they needed. And again, speaking to the work that Yumi has always been about community and doing. And Veronica had a huge part in really showing and leading these programs at Yumi. And she also begins to, so what happens next? So Dr. Gordon, he leaves retires as Yumi's director, although still ever vigilant, right, and active in his work. And Veronica actually leads this transition for a bit. And in summing up this era, this long 16-year era or so, remember, no more ERIC, right? So that federal funding was no longer through the pipeline. There was the Great Recession. All universities were struggling to keep things afloat. Teachers College was certainly no different. And we were, now technically off campus, right? They had its own campus in Harlem. So doing amazing community work during these years, right? I had this in orange here, but a bit of a less visible footprint on campus than perhaps in previous decades, although still doing so much great community work and other research, right? And so in thinking about that transition, as Dr. Gordon retires as Yumi's director, there is a national search for a new director. And Veronica is helping to manage this transition. And I have here rejuvenation and a fresh research agenda. And I think that's what happens with the hiring of Dr. Ernest Morrell from UCLA, one of my mentors. I was an undergraduate student in the 2000s and happened to fortunately come to Teachers College at the time that he did. And as Provost James said at the time, Dr. Ernest Morrell to, quote, lead TC Signature Institute, Urban Institute into a new era. And he begins in 2011 and serves till 2017. And as he came to the Institute to lead Yumi, he kind of had a couple tabs or threads he was trying to pull on in terms of his goals as a leader. One of them is to re-engage the TC campus, right? How can we make sure Yumi is visible on campus? People are knowing the work that we're doing, building on the work that we're doing, using the work that we're doing, right, to make schools and kids' lives better, right? And there were a lot of events that happened. One of them was the Yumi Colloquia series. which many of you I'm sure remember, right, is that if you are a grad student or a postdoctoral scholar or junior faculty, come share your work. Give a room here at Teachers College on the Gordon campus and eventually on here, and people can come and learn about your work. And it was a low-stakes environment, but it was showing the work that Yumi was doing and graduate students were doing, and there was like 25 of them in like a 6-year period. That's a lot of events of like, okay, this is the work that Yumi is doing, and come learn about it. It supported graduate students and also supported, again, Yumi's visibility here. And this is one of them, 2012, Dr. Liscott, Dr. Bell. If anyone knows Dr. Liscott's famous TED Talk, this is when she did it actually, before it went viral. This was the moment. I remember recording this in the back, and now I'm here speaking again. It's full circle for me. This is at the Gordon campus, a packed house. And so these types of events were happening every month. You're going to see some flyers of these, I think, in the timeline, right? The flyers have definitely improved. I don't know who designed those, but it was me. So they're much better now. But this is an example of the visibility that Yumi was gaining at TC. And as a result, they're invited to be back on main campus in Zanko Hall, which they are today. And you can kind of see the picture here if you can. All we had was the furniture. Office looks much beautiful now. We're all like on the desks, so those are the early days of Yumi at Zanko. So now we're back on campus in 2013 because of the work that we're doing. And in addition to thinking about visibility and the work of Yumi and urban education, right? In 2013, the Gordon Lecture Series is founded. And this was a series in honor of Dr. Gordon and his legacy of work and training so many scholars and impacting so many scholars. So what this was that top scholars across the country doing work on marginalized communities, on black youth, on bilingualism, would come to Teachers College, share their research, share their work that'd be sponsored by Yumi, and again, increasing Yumi's visibility, bringing attention to these important lines of research that often are not getting the attention they deserve, right? And this is something that goes on today, and in honor of Dr. Gordon and the legacy that he has long had and continues to have here. Of course, there's a million things we could always bring up. In terms of the next kind of goal that Dr. Morrell was trying to pull on was definitely continuing community engagement. For the sake of time, I won't go into some of those projects, but Veronica Holly was still leading these projects, and other graduate students were still deeply involved in the community in Harlem. And then another kind of goal of his was to think about external collaborations. How do we work with TC faculty, but also work with faculty outside of TC to do something awesome, right? And there's a variety of examples of this, right? I could pick 30 different things, but for the sake of time, I picked one, right? 2014, the Educating Harlem Project. Dr. Ansley Erickson was partnering with Dr. Ernest Morrell, and they were leading this project, and top historians all across the country were coming to Teachers College to document Harlem's rich educational legacy of activism, right, resulted in a co-edited book with Columbia University Press in 2019. So again, this external collaboration, TC, Yumi as that hub, as that connective tissue, right? 2016, the African Diaspora Consortium, which still goes on today, right? Yumi partners with the College Board and other scholars with expertise in the African diaspora to create the first ever African diaspora themed AP course, right? So significant work being done, collaborations across the board here. And again, I could make dozens of dots here, as I could for every decade as well. But at the heart of Yumi has always been research. We are a research institute, and there was a fresh research agenda part of Dr. Morrell's work leadership, right? And that was a focus on youth engagement. He was a scholar of youth engagement and literacy, and by this time, there were no more divisions. If you remember the divisions of the 80s and 90s, we didn't have that size and scope of those divisions. And so the strategy here was I'm going to provide flexibility and funding as possible to empower graduate students to lead their own projects and support them in that way. And that's really what happened. There's a lot of graduate students. It wasn't really about, and this has always been about this has always kind of defined Yumi. Yumi isn't a what, Yumi is a who, right? Investing in the people who care about social justice, who care about change, who want to engage in critical research, and that certainly was happening in this era, as it has in every era, right? And so among those projects, a whole host of them are happening during these years. Again, I could have picked any number of them. One of them was one that I worked on. I happen to have a lot of pictures for it, so it was easier to share. It was a Youth Historians in Harlem project. We were working with young people in Harlem who were learning and investigating the history of their own community, right? History of their Harlem block to increase reading and writing skills. The Ciphers for Justice program, which many of you are familiar with, right? Hip-hop education, spoken word, led by Dr. Liscott, Dr. Caraballo, and many others, about how do we engage and celebrate the brilliance of youth, their skill sets, thinking about English education in particular. All these types of work resulted in publications. There's research on ethnic studies. So many projects going on at this time by graduate students. And I know I got a few more minutes left, so I'll just kind of wrap up Dr. Morell's kind of era, and I think this applies to everything before, right? This was President Bailey in one of your interviews had said, UME has, quote, always made those issues of social justice front and center. Teachers College has long been seen by students and faculty as being, quote, devoted to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And I think one of the foundations of that has been the presence of UME. We certainly see that during these years and every year of UME's existence, making that impact here at Teachers College and supporting the values and the missions of this institution, right? So Dr. Morell leaves, and we'll just go briefly through the final era here. And there's a call for a new director, and that call does not leave this building because the next director, as you all know, suspense, right, is Dr. Erica Walker. During what I'm titling a golden era of research and collaboration, which I think continues to this day, right? Dr. Walker, and this is her words, was really coming home at this time. She had been here for many years. She served till 2022, but I think she began at Teachers College in 2001 as a minority postdoctoral fellow, was a UME faculty fellow, a research fellow. So again, thinking about intergenerationality, I have my blue dots there, right? Someone who knows the work of UME, who worked in UME, worked with UME faculty, cares about young people, brings her expertise in STEM to the Institute as opposed to more humanities focused in the previous director, right? And she does a host of new things. But when she comes in, she asks this question. She goes, quote, how can UME best and innovatively produce, use, and disseminate research to enhance the lives of millions of brilliant young people? And when she was thinking about that question, what really came to mind was like, well, to answer that, how? It's through collaboration. Right? And I think this era really speaks to this so many collaborations among TC faculty and others, right? She really worked to tap into the genius of this institution, of the many talented students and staff here. And again, I could spend 50 minutes just on all the dots on this timeline. I'll just pick a few things as examples of this type of collaboration. One of them was the 2018 Telling Mathematics Stories project. Yumi and Dr. Walker, they partnered with the National Association of Mathematicians, 3 or 4 different departments here at Teachers College, right, to tell the stories of black mathematicians, of elders. And it was a really powerful project and, again, speaks to this collaboration. Dr. Amy Stewart Wells was also a principal investigator, who's someone who's worked at UME for a long time, intergenerationality, right, and speaks to this importance of collaboration. But the world shuts down. We have COVID-19, universities shut down, and many institutes bury their head in the sand, but not UME, right? As I was speaking with others about, well, what was UME like during these years? Obviously, I was on the periphery, but still, it was kind of like, let's get to work, right? Let's not do what others. Let's use this time to be as productive as we've ever been. And so during these years, and this continues today, right? Not COVID, thank goodness, and to the level that it was before, but in terms of the fact that UME affiliate faculty really were able to secure large grant money unseen for decades, since the 70s, since the 80s, right? Big projects that they're receiving money for to do big things, because we need to do big things, right, and big ideas, right? Again, of this in 2020, to build on this Telling Mathematics Stories project, a $1.5 million grant from the Spencer Foundation. This is an example of that. Again, 2021, there is the work being done by Dr. Sonia Douglas with the Black Education Research Collective, right? Receives $3.25 million from New York City. Research around COVID-19 and systemic racism. Again, these are all projects that are led by TC faculty, but UME is always there to provide intellectual support and collaboration, right? Dr. Ansley Erickson doing research around and projects around New York City civil rights curriculum, among many different grants that she's secured around the teaching of history in a really powerful and progressive and critical way. And again, projects led by TC faculty, but in collaboration to some extent with UME. And there are just so much more. I could spend so much time on this, right? And leadership and Dr. Rajan in terms of gun violence, taking it back to the 1990s. There's so many projects. The REACH program, I wish I could spend time on them, as many of you know, right? But to wrap things up here, as I also think about this era, not just from the many projects that all of you are involved in and know about that are ongoing, why I have the arrow, the symbolism matters here, right? There's also a focus on legacy. I think that's really important for this moment and today, right? During these years, Dr. Walker and UME established the W.E.B. Du Bois Scholars Program. Again, thinking about, it's in blue, right? Intergenerationality, supporting doctoral students, right? Funding them, making sure they have the support to grow as scholars. Dr. Smith, one of our first recipient, right? Speaking in honor of Dr. Du Bois, and again, this speaks to who UME has always been about, right? Supporting scholars doing powerful work. And speaking of legacy, right, in 2021, as I think many of you, if not all, remember, there was the Edmund W. Gordon Centennial Conference to honor Dr. Gordon's 100th birthday. And June 3rd, 2021, a momentous occasion, momentous event. And as a result of the momentous event, in 2021, UME is renamed to the Edmund W. Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education at Teachers College, Columbia University, right? Again, in honor of Dr. Gordon and all that he has meant to this institute. Yes. And to have him here with us today, still being our trusted leader and our source of inspiration is beautiful beyond words. So thank you for being here again, Dr. Gordon. And of course, in 2022, Dr. Walker leaves Teachers College, and we have our new director, Dr. Ezekiel Dixon-Román, who is continuing this incredible work of the Institute and all that is to come. I'm so excited for. And just to kind of wrap up in thinking about UME and all of this very, very brief history. In the report, there's a lot more detail, right? But as I was reflecting on what is UME? What is UME about? And Dr. Gordon said this a couple of years ago in reflection, that education is about relationships between people, right? And so from Gordon himself to all the intervening directors and students and faculty that named and mostly unnamed in this timeline, right, to Dixon-Román today, the history of UME has been a passing of a communal baton amongst like-minded scholars of all disciplines, of all backgrounds, of all ranks, in order to provide equitable opportunities for all children in all communities, right? Through the individual efforts of people working together collaboratively towards a common goal, UME has done that for the last 50 years, and I absolutely know we'll continue to do that for another 50 more. Thank you so much. What's our time? You want to take questions? A bit longer, but sorry. All right. A lot of history in 40 minutes or so. I guess we got time for 1 or 2 questions, right? Yeah. Any questions? Yeah, mics are right here if you need to use them, or you can shout as well. And I'm processing a lot, right? That's probably an hour-and-a-half lecture in about 40 minutes, so I'm well aware of that, but flew from California last night, so I had to make use of the time. No. Any questions? All right, well, I will just say again, thank you for this honor to be here. I can't wait to see what UME will do in the next 50 years and beyond, so thanks so much. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. I can't thank you enough. Thank you.
I think, like many of you, I am completely in awe and moved by this absolutely excellent and well done just presentation of the history, a 50-year history in 45 minutes is quite impressive. But more importantly, so much to be learned about UME in this presentation. I appreciate the many touch points of speaking to not just the various, obviously, the founder and directors, but also projects and the context in which those projects were emerging from and responding to and engaging. And even, of course, the blue, green, and orange reminders and themes of community, intergenerationality, and praxis. Thank you. So thank you, Barry. This was absolutely amazing. I want to take a moment to, we'll break for, let's see, I think we have about 10 minutes, actually 11 minutes. So we'll come back at 11 o'clock, we'll break and come back at 11, and then we'll begin with our first panel for the morning. Okay, okay, all right.
What do you need? Water?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Actually, I'm going to go. Sorry.
And then also, I just found out
Yeah, I saw her. Who is she?
she's with the
On the
Bronx
other
Borough
Okay.
president.
Yeah, I got her card too. Do we need to acknowledge
Should
her?
I,
We need to let Mark know, probably.
with my,
Okay. Hold on.
yeah. All right.
You got 4 minutes.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and everything.
This was amazing. This was absolutely amazing. So thank you.
Profoundly honored. I can't.
Okay. Is there any particular way you want this to go? Yeah, I'll do the introduction of the panel from, I'll come up behind you here. Are you going to do it from here? Yeah.
Just give me a second. When I sit down, I'll just. You want to talk to Sarah? Hold on. I'm just taking it.
Right. So we're gonna get going. Right. Okay. Brianna had just. This is Paula. Yeah. Okay, if we can all begin to find our seats.
So nice to see you. I emailed you.
I'm gonna get around to you. I got you.
I know you're busy, but let's see what we can do, okay?
I got you. Yep.
Okay, for real. Okay, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
You're beautiful as always.
He wants a photo before you.
Oh. Can we, Paola? Okay. Okay, so we're going to get started with our morning panel. Hi. So this morning's panel will feature scholarship on the first two research areas of the Institute. I'll speak a bit more about the new research areas later this afternoon during the keynote. But the first research area being on radically transforming pedagogy and designing curricula. And the second being around rethinking and designing assessment in the service of teaching and learning. This will include research on racial literacies, alternative uses of AI for assessment focused on Black and brown children, and the decolonization and development of a curriculum on and with the Lenape people. This panel will be moderated by a longtime friend, a fellow Yumi postdoc almost 20 years ago, and in Professor Gordon's words, one of the most decent human beings I've known, Dr. David Walrice. David is professor of psychology at Morehouse College with a program of study that places emphasis on identity and personality. The primary vehicle for this work is the Identity, Art, and Democracy Lab, a research space where Rice and his colleagues examine identity through life stories and an asset-based lens. He graduated from Morehouse with a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology, earned a doctorate in personality psychology from Howard University, and did postdoctoral research at Teachers College, Columbia University within the Institute for Urban and Minority Education. He's also additionally an alum of Columbia University as well, where he obtained his master's degree in journalism. His edited volume, Identity Orchestration, Black Lives, Balance, and the Psychology of Self-Stories, a follow-up to his authored book, Balance, Advancing Identity Theory by Engaging the Black Male Adolescent, is an effective representation of David Walrice's The Identity, Art, and Democracy Research Lab and the work they engage. David, my brother, and friend and colleague, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you for making the trip and for the work you did to moderate this session.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? It's such a blessing to be here. I was saying yesterday I was fortunate to have been able to have given a talk and to be in the presence of Professor Gordon, of course, is a gift, but to be in the space that he has fomented and developed for us where we can all come together and do a radical, life-changing work is so very important. So it's a distinct pleasure for me to be here. My job as moderator, I see, is to get out of the way of genius that is going to be with us today. Again, this is radically transforming pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment. And so we're going to look at how it is that these scholars and these thinkers have leaned in meaningful ways to ensure that the way that we have been trained is disrupted, and the way that we learn and know things is more wholly understood as we engage the individuals and the communities that we are charged to be a part of and to operate within. So what I'll do now is I'll simply, in alphabetical order, I'll introduce our panelists and then our discussant, and then we'll let them, we'll let them go to work. Does that sound all right with everybody? We're okay with that? We're okay? You guys okay? Yes. I mean, yeah, let's talk. I mean, it's okay. All right, Temple Lovelace is first, is the founder and executive director of Assessment for Good. Assessment for Good is an inclusive R&D program supported by the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund that grew out of a commitment to transform the role of assessment so that it is identity affirming and honors the continuum of a learner's development. Dr. Lovelace's research focuses on the intersection of disability, race, and gender with a specific focus on pathways of opportunity for Black neurodivergent girls. During her tenure in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, she launched 3 successful university community YPAR collaboratives, Youth Leading Change, Education Uncontained, and Girlhood Rising, which resulted in emancipatory R&D, a framework for agentic transformative change. Please let's welcome Dr. Lovelace. Next, we have Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, a graduate of NYU and Columbia Universities, as a professor of English education at Teachers College here at Columbia University. Dr. Sealey-Ruiz is a sought-after speaker on educational equity issues, author of numerous academic articles, co-editor of 4 books, and co-author of the multiple award-winning book, Advancing Racial Literacies in Teacher Education, Activism for Equity in Digital Spaces, where she examines her concept of archaeology of self in education. At Teachers College, she is founder of the Racial Literacy Roundtable series, where for 15 years, national scholars, teachers, and students facilitate conversations around race and other issues involving diversity. Dr. Sealey-Ruiz has appeared in several documentaries, including Spike Lee's Two Fists Up, We're Gonna Be All Right, a documentary about the Black Lives Matter movement and the campus protests at Mizzou. Her first full-length collection of poetry, Love from the Vortex and Other Poems, was published in March of 2020. Her sophomore book of poetry, The Peace Chronicles, was published in July 2021, showcasing her interdisciplinary nature of her work. Dr. Sealey-Ruiz's poetry books have gained recognition and have been embraced by jazz and avant-garde classical musicians. Beyond her artistic pursuits, Dr. Sealey-Ruiz's archaeology of the self theory and practice concept has been presented to thousands of educators and educational leaders within the United States and abroad. Dr. Sealey-Ruiz. Next, we have Rachel Talbert of Teachers College here again at Columbia University. She is lecturer in the Curriculum and Teaching Department and research, a fellow at TC's Edmund W. Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education. Her teaching and research center, Survivance, is that correct? Survivance, okay, thank you, gotta help me out. Survivance, an active sense of Native presence over absence and supporting Indigenous students through curriculum with particular attention to students in city public school spaces. Dr. Talbert is committed to a curriculum that supports all students learning about American Indian sovereignty and self-determination. Her research seeks to understand the impact of pre-K through 12 curriculum centering sovereignty and survivance to better understand how such a curriculum supports teachers in public schools. Her research with urban Indigenous youth in public schools focuses on civic identity negotiation and its relationship to tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Dr. Talbert, please join us. And finally, we have our discussant, Felicia Mensah, is the Department Chair of Mathematics, Science, and Technology and Professor of Science Education at Teachers College. Dr. Mensah is a past Associate Dean at Teachers College. She worked closely with the Office of Student Affairs, the Office of Community and Diversity, and the Provost's Office in doing faculty development and promoting student academic development. She is currently the faculty advisor for the Black Student Network, past advisor to the Doctoral Research Collective on Race and Ethnicity, and former moderator and host of the monthly Cited Conversations, which stands for Critical Conversations in Teacher Education and Development. This platform promotes scholars of color doing innovative research across diverse fields in teacher education and professional development. In Dr. Mensah's current work, she utilizes critical race theory, racial literacy, and intersectionality to transform teacher education research and practice. Her focus on preparing future teacher educators and teacher educators of colors for racial literacy combines years of teaching, mentoring, and outreach in pre-K-12 schools, post-secondary education, and teacher professional development. Dr. Mensah is the author of Like Worlds Falling into the Page, Demystifying the Academic Writing and Publishing Process, and Baby Qual podcast, which both support academic writers. Dr. Mensah is a past president of Sisters of the Academy Institute, or SOTA, an organization supporting Black women's success in higher education, And among other activities, she is co-editor of the Journal of Research in Science Teaching, a lead editor of Cultural Studies of Science Education, and an associate editor of Learners of the African Diaspora Journal. Before her life in academia, Dr. Mensah was a former high school science teacher, and before teaching, she worked as a laboratory scientist in a large regional hospital and big multinational consumer goods corporation in North Carolina. Her home, Dr. Mensah, please join us. All right, so we'll proceed as the program instructs us. We'll have presentations from each of the panelists. There'll be about 15 minutes apiece, and then we'll have our discussant lean in, and then I get to have fun in peppering everyone with a few questions and hopefully opening it up to the audience as well. All right, so our first presenter, Dr. Sealey-Ruiz, is that you?
Yes.
Oh, man, I
Can
love
we
you.
please thank Dr. David Wall-Rice for, yes, making the trip, but also being who you are. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Hello. Good morning. Dr. Gordon, thank you. We are here because of you. I have one slide to share, and this is the current version of my racial literacy development model. And I want to thank Dr. Angel Acosta, who is my former student. You know, our students show up in our classrooms and they really are teachers. And he came in masquerading as a student and has been my teacher ever since in many ways, including healing-centered education, but also helping me visualize the racial literacy development model. So what I want to do is really just quickly say something about the model and then share with you how I've been thinking about how the model can impact policy, and specifically policy in teacher education. This is where I'm dreaming. I have big dreams about teacher education within New York State, within New York City, but also nationally. I have big dreams about the idea of being archaeologists of self and getting to know ourselves when it is most difficult, all for the support of children. So what I will say is over COVID, organically, these 6 components became 3 to 4 hour professional learning experiences. I almost said unlearning because I think that professional learning should be more about unlearning what we believe we know and what we've been taught. So one thing I'll have to say, although it's not necessarily hierarchical, although it is in the shape of a pyramid, I'm still struggling with the design. Design 2.0 is the design of a shovel. I'm now working with a designer for a 3D design because I'm a visual learner. And so what I'm trying to put out in the world, it has to make sense for me visually. But one thing I will say that does not shift and cannot shift is the component on the bottom, and that is critical love. So when I engage with teachers and superintendents and staff members and students, but mostly the adults in the lives of children, I tell them that you must do this work because you love them. If you cannot access a profound and ethical commitment for them, then you must question why you're doing what you're doing. And so critical love for me in my classroom at Teachers College, with the students that I teach, professional development with adults, I love them first. And if I start with love, then we can maybe start telling the truth about some things. The critical humility piece and critical reflection, I was a student at Teachers College 3 years ago, because I'm only about 27, a few years ago. And the one thing Teachers College taught me is to be a critically reflective practitioner, almost to the point of, why are you asking me to reflect? Because I was so used to what Freire talks about in terms of the banking model of education. I was a great student, showed up, listened to the lectures, the lessons, wrote them down, gave them back on the tests. We were socialized that way. But when I came to Teachers College in my early 20s, I was asked literally the profound question, very simple, well, what do you think about this? And I didn't know how to answer. But over that year and a half of getting my master's degree, I became a critically reflective practitioner. And so critical reflection has to be part of anything that I do in my own teaching, anything that I am asking adults to do with children. And the humility piece must be there. And this, I think, you know, the Buddhists tell us that the ego is very, very dangerous, right? The ego is dangerous because the ego often gets in the way of learning that we need to have. Particularly if we've been teaching 20, 30 years, to some extent we think we know it. We don't. We know it for that moment with those children who are in front of us. So to have a humble spirit, a humble heart, is what's most important for continued lifelong learning, in my opinion. And then, of course, historical literacy. We are an ahistorical country. We are also a country that have been given, in the words of Lee Bell, stock stories about what history is. We give it in the classroom, we ask it on the exams, and we never, which is why I'm so grateful for my sister, Dr. Talbert, interrupting this space to talk about indigenous, the original Americans, the original folks who cultivated this land and inhabited this land. And they have all but been erased in education. What is also erased is Black history and replaced often with anti-Blackness. What is also erased is Latino history, on and on and on, right? How many of us know, and this is pertinent to COVID, that a Latino scientist created hand sanitizer? How many of us know that the cell phone you use every day, the computer, when you open your refrigerator, when you stop at a traffic light, when you lace your shoe, when you pull out that bed, and Lord, when you open up the folding chair? Okay, y'all didn't see the TikTok? Okay, work with me here. It's a Black scientist is what I'm saying, right? All of that has been erased. So for me, historical literacy has to be part of racial literacy, because how are you going to be racially literate with a group and you don't know their history? And I always tell teachers, if you understood specifically for Black folk that the inventions that my ancestors created make your everyday life so much easier, perhaps you'd have more respect for the children that you're teaching. So historical literacy is important. Of course, archaeology of the self. It is the self that does the work of critical love, of critical humility, of critical reflection, of learning the history. And my hope is that we will be interrupters. I do not claim to be a teacher educator, although that is my official title. At best, I can be a teacher interrupter. At best, I can interrupt myself, and I can interrupt those that are in fellowship with me to interrupt how they think about children and what they've come to believe, what their abilities are. That is the model. My hope in the last 5 minutes I want to share for you is that New York State will create a racial literacy course where archaeology of self is a capstone. That is the goal, right? Thank y'all, right? And I've been in communication with, State Chancellor Lester Young, because you may as well go to the top. Because when you're dreaming, or freedom dreaming, as Dr. Robin Kelly would say, you have to do what Uncle Jimmy, James Baldwin, told us, and that is to go for broke. I cannot have fear if I'm trying to dream a different world. And so my hope is that this concept of racial literacy, which was named by sociologist Frances Wendance Twine, pulled into the universe and legal studies of Lonnie Guinier, brought into education by several people, Melissa Mosley, Rebecca Rogers, Jane Bogatz in social studies, so many folks. Spike Lee, for me, is also a racial literacy please, Spike, don't go anywhere. We need you. No, but the work that he does, and he uses the medium of film to build people's racial literacy. So racial literacy should be built in multimodal ways. People do it through poetry, they do it through film, we do it through teaching. And so my hope is that this skill and practice will be valued enough that teacher education programs will take it on. I'll just tell you really quickly, about 2 years ago, I was a CERN mid-career fellow, and I had to think about racial literacy in the terms of policy. And that was the best thing that happened in my life. And I thought about this in terms of 3 levels. The first level, there are 17 New York State Teacher Opportunity Corps program. There is a Teacher Opportunity Corps program here at TC. I taught in it for 5 years. My goal is to have the racial literacy course And I see Matt Camp back there. I want to give Matt a shout out because he was a co-thinker with me in this dreaming. Matt, I'm still holding on to the dream. That the 17 TOC programs will adopt the course. That's first level. That in some ways can be a pilot for the entire state. The second level, of course, is New York State and New York City colleges and university teacher education programs to have this racial literacy course with archaeology of the self as a capstone. And then third, of course, because we need our babies and our teachers in independent schools to engage in this work as well, that the independent schools nationwide, state, city, college, university, teacher education programs, oh, that's the fourth level, sorry y'all. The third level is independent and private New York State and city colleges, university teacher education programs, and then nationwide. So this is my dream. This is what I will continue to put my energy into, and this is how I'm trying to make a difference in the world. Thank you for listening. And I'm passing the mic. Dr. Lovelace? Doctor? Okay. To Dr. Talbert.
I don't have a mic. Okay. Thank you so much. That's the clicker. I need the clicker. I think we need to go backwards. That's the last slide. There we go. Backwards more. There we go. Thank you. So first of all, just thank you to Dr. Gordon. Without Yumi, this research wouldn't be here in New York City, and I'm very aware of that and cognizant of that. So thank you, because your dream helped make this possible. I just want to take some time to emphasize that we're on Lenape land, and much better than a land acknowledgement is what we're actually doing here at TC, which is taking action. But people always ask me, can you tell me about the Lenape? And I tell them the very best way to do this would be to take a look at this 14-minute video, which was created by the Lenape for the Lenape, and to listen to their asks. So if you're interested, raise your phone, and it'll take you to a great video, and you can learn a little bit more about the Lenape. Also thinking about, this is the video that we use in our middle school and high school curriculum that we've developed with the Lenape Center. So it's really a beautiful resource to have. I think someone is clicking through for me. Great. Okay.
Hello.
Oh, we're on a video already. You don't know? I am controlling it? Uh-oh. Who's really in control? I have overall control. Okay, you have overall control? Okay, great. But for the video, okay. We'll do the videos on the very last slide. Thank you. Yay. So we can go to the second slide. Great. So I also feel like it's important to acknowledge Lenape removals and displacements. They are ongoing features of settler colonialism in the United States. The Lenape were removed 17 times. So there are Lenape people still living here in Lenapehoking, which is modern-day New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, southern tip of Connecticut, northern part of Delaware. But there are also Lenape people living in all of these places on the map in states too numerous to mention, and in formal federally recognized spaces in Oklahoma. And we don't learn about that. So Dr. Sealey-Ruiz, you're absolutely right. We can't do this work without really learning about the critical histories that have been left behind. It's something we don't talk about in public schools. There we go. And if you don't know about that, it's understandable because we have research that shows us that most content in social studies deals with Native people and tribes pre-1900s. And so because we have a frontier view, and that is a picture of Gast's American Progress from 1873, you'll find it in every social studies textbook in a major market. In New York City, in Texas, in Florida, in California, we use that picture to teach about manifest destiny. But because we stopped teaching about Native people and nations in our standards in the 1900s, our students don't learn about urban relocation from 1952 to 1972, wherein indigenous people across the United States were given the option to move to cities with very little, 1 month rent, promise of perhaps a job, and putting their children in excellent urban public schools. It's why you see a lot of Native people still in cities today. It's why you see spaces like the American Indian Community House in New York City, Chicago's Native American Center, and Native American centers in Detroit and Cleveland and Denver, and all of these places where Native peoples were relocated to. And that was in an attempt to enforce a policy in the late 1950s of tribal termination here in the United States. So to completely eradicate US responsibility for tribal nations by relocating indigenous people to urban spaces. We don't learn about the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, wherein indigenous nations were told if they wanted funding from FDR's New Deal, they needed to make their tribal constitutions look just like the United States Constitution. We don't learn about Covell v. Salazar, one of the longest running Supreme Court cases in the United States from 1996 to 2009, wherein the US Department of Interior lost indigenous land deeds or left them to rot in barns and old offices across the United States. And then it was the largest financial settlement ever received by Native peoples. We don't learn about the Carcieri Fix, the Indian Child Welfare Act, or the Violence Against Women Act and how it impacts Native nations. And we certainly don't learn about our own treaty obligations, which should be ongoing, but in most cases are broken. So why does this matter? A lot of people ask me, so why are you in New York City doing work with indigenous people? So 93% of indigenous children K-12 are in public schools. They are not in schools on the reservation, and a majority of Native students live off the reservation and increasingly in urban spaces. So we have to pay attention in our urban public schools to where Native youth are. And it doesn't just matter for Native youth. For non-Native students, understanding Native nations within the United States is critical for participation in public life if we're serious about social justice, equity, and honoring treaties. I always feel that it's important to engage with teachers where they are, and so many teachers where they are as well. I don't think I've ever had an indigenous student in my class, or I don't know if I have. Or why would I teach this? And I say, because we live in a democracy where all of our students make decisions about what happens to Native nations. They all do. And because we live in a space in an urban area where we do have Native kids in our classrooms. So I just like to remind people that Indian nations are nations. They are not, a solely racialized identity. Brian Brayboy tells us in Tribal Critical Race Theory that we have to be attentive in education to the dual nature of how indigenous students show up in our classrooms, that they are not just a race, they are members of sovereign nations within our nations. And if we want to be serious about treaty obligations, that's knowledge that all of our students need to know. So why do curriculum with the Lenape Center? Because they asked. When I got to TC, I went and had coffee with Joe Baker and Hadrian Kumans from the Lenape Center. And I came here as a minority postdoctoral fellow to do work with urban indigenous youth in New York City, which I am still doing. But I'm talking mostly today about a coffee conversation I had where the Lenape Center said, I said, what can I do? I'm here, I'm on your land, what can I do? And they said, help us develop curriculum. So this is not TC's curriculum, it is not my curriculum, it is the Lenape Center's curriculum, they own it. But we center a couple things in the work we do with the Lenape. We center citizenship over culture, and we teach tribal sovereignty. We have a partnership with the Lenape, whose land our school teachers college is on. We learn about the treaties that govern the land that we are on, because that's important. I know way more personally about the Treaty of Versailles, which I had to learn when I was in high school, than I know about the Treaty of Canandaigua in upstate New York, or the Walking Purchase or Penn's Treaty in Pennsylvania. And what I learned about New York was that it was sold to the Dutch by the Lenape for 60 guilders, which we know is a myth. So that's unlearning we all have to do in this space if we're serious about social justice. So we discuss removals, genocide, and the ongoing presence of the Lenape. And we use Gerald Weisner's work as our North Star. He's an Anishinaabe scholar. And we center an active sense of Native presence over absence. Because we want to learn about the removals and we want to learn about the genocide, but we also want to center the ongoing presence of the Lenape here and in all the spaces where Lenape people are and will be in the future. So Lenape futurity. We look at current issues of the Lenape and we acknowledge sovereignty when we talk about civics. So I'm going to give you 2 small tastes of the curriculum. These are different pieces of the curriculum. I didn't do this, again, by myself. The Lenape Center are the editors. They are the final word on all of these pieces of curriculum. And the doctoral students here at TC and master students here at TC in a class that I wouldn't have had if I wasn't a minority postdoc, called Teaching for Survivance and Sovereignty, are the ones who are the co-creators of this work. So you'll notice that the titles of this curriculum center the Lenape in present tense. Again, working with that Native presence and survivance. Who are the Lenape? We also released the curriculum at a play, because we love art, called Mannahatta, which showed at the Public Theater. So the curriculum was debuted thanks to Yumi for the very first time on Chancellor's Day last year. So grateful for that. And the curriculum was debuted again in November at the public showing of Mannahatta for New York City public school teachers. And with that, we'll do a little taste of the curriculum. And thank you to being in control up at the top.
Hello, sweet Winklechick. It's me, Chulented, Little Bird. Last week, we learned about Curtis and the Makwa, or bear on Lenape Hoking, also known as the land of the Lenape. This week, we are going to explore a little island called Mannahatta. Can you guess what Mannahatta is called today? Today, Mannahatta is called Manhattan. Mannahatta is one of the places where Lenape people lived in the past, live today, and will live in the future. Mannahatta is an important part of Lenape Hoking, or Lenape land. Now, I want you to imagine what Mannahatta must have looked like a long time ago before European colonizers forced the Lenape out of Mannahatta. Muksulhemen shitulip, or tulip trees, are all over, covering the sky in some places and making it easier for the Lenape memensak, or children, to climb. Memekas, or butterflies, flap their wings and feed off of the nehenawalache, or milkweed. Temakwayuk, or beavers, swim freely in the Mahiakanatuk, now known as the Hudson River. Isn't it so beautiful? We all know that Manhattan does not look like this anymore, right? Well, let's explore why it has changed so much. The Lenape are the original people of Manhattan. They take care of the animals, lands, and each other with the natural resources given to them by Haki, or Mother Earth. In 1609, Henry Hudson came to Mannahatta for the Dutch East India Company and renamed the Mahiakanatuk the Hudson River. After the Dutch East India Company made contact with the Lenape, the Dutch stole their land and pushed them off of Lenape Hoking. For many years after this, the Lenape have fought to stay on their lands and keep their language and culture alive. Lenape people are still here in Mannahatta, Lenape Hoking, and in other parts of America, like Oklahoma, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Canada. Remember, Winklechick, although Manhattan looks different today, it is still Lenape Hoking, or part of the Lenape homeland. Now, let's review some of the Lenape words we used in our video today. Repeat after me. Mannahatta.
You were ready. I wanted to give everyone just a little taste of the curriculum for younger students. You see what survivance looks like? And we'll give you a small taste of the video for high school students and middle school students that hopefully you've all scanned your QR code and can watch in full.
So here we are in the center, the heart of Manhattan. standing on this concrete among all these buildings. This is Lenapehoking. Our ancestors are still here.
By going back, we combat the erasure of the Lenape, because the Lenape, until just fairly recently, were still kind of in the history books.
Or sometimes not. Here's the history textbook from when I was in school. There's no mention of the Lenape. But there is this: praise for the Dutch for buying Manhattan from the Indians.
Some things are beginning to change. Collegiate school students now study the Lenape, and Columbia University and the Metropolitan Museum of Art have installed plaques stating they sit on Lenape homeland. But for decades, the only hints of the Lenape found in Manhattan were on the seal of the city and on two monuments to the Dutch transaction. One on the southern tip of the island in Battery Park, and the other way up north in Inwood Hill Park.
So as we're coming along the pathway in Inwood Hill Park, we come upon this plaque, which, according to legend, is the actual place of the mythical purchase of Manhattan, 1626, for 60 guilders.
There is, of course, a problem with that narrative.
Mannahatta, as it was known, was not sold to the Dutch.
It's a mythical purchase.
The purchase of Manhattan is a myth.
A land grab.
Total mythology.
This is a myth, a magical recreation or the erasure of our people.
It just plain couldn't have happened for at least two reasons. First, the Lenape had no concept of land ownership.
How do you own the earth with its great spirit power? How do you own the sky? How do you own the air? How do you own the waters? You don't.
And second, the Dutch struck the deal with Lenape men who didn't have the authority. In Lenapehoking, it was the women who made the big decisions.
It's part of the big lie. And if you lie enough and in a big enough way, it becomes believable. The idea of a purchase of land was carefully orchestrated into the psyche.
So I just so appreciate the opportunity to be in this space. I so appreciate Yumi's generosity in bringing in Indigenous curriculum and supporting this work. It's so needed, and our partners who you saw in that video are also so thankful. And I just want to point out that when we had them in this space last summer, they noted that it was the first time Lenape language had been spoken on Lenape land here at Teachers College. And so I love the fact that we don't have that anymore. We invite the Lenape here frequently. They come, they record at DFI, and they're here in this space. And so just very much appreciate that, and thank you.
Good morning. Yes, for 15 more minutes. Good morning. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation from both of you to be able to be here. I enter this space as a learner, and I enter this time together as with an offer for you, an offer for you to think with me about what the multiple futures that could be possible through assessment. I will also confess that I'm a person who messes with their slides until the moment they present. And so bear with me as my notes will not match these slides because they were pulled before I had to go. So let's take a walk through thinking about the future. And so I come here from North Carolina. That's where I flew in this morning, from North Carolina. And I run a research and development program called Assessment for Good. Assessment for Good was born out of the work that happened in southwestern Pennsylvania with over 500 educators and young people who wanted to change a policy, a practice, a learning space in their schools. And so we work with them to figure out what that might look like. Through emancipatory R&D, we've been thinking about what should the future of assessment be. And so I want to introduce you to it today. I got a whole lot. I got phone for notes and a mic and a clicker, so let's see how this goes. So what is assessment? I want to start a little bit with the past. When we first started, we did a study. We looked at the early childhood longitudinal survey, and we took a look at the latent profiles that emerged from that data set of thousands, over 20,000, I believe, young people over time. And our goal was to figure out what were the profiles of the learners that rose up. And there were three main profiles that rose up. The first were a set of learners who we named socially withdrew from school, right? So the scores that were collected as a part of ECLS showed that they socially withdrew from school. You can imagine what those learners looked like, right? So they looked like me, darker skinned, may have been learners who identified as a young girl, learners who may have identified as disabled. We had a second profile of learners who came through the work, and the second profile were learners who academically withdrew from school, okay? And then the third were a group of learners who had an aligned experience with school. Now you can only imagine with those learners, what they look like, nothing like me. Fair-skinned, coming from a family that had economic security. And when I think about those three profiles, largely our assessment practices today still give us information in those three lanes. We have learners for whom the opportunities that they get push them out of a social and emotional engagement with their peers, with their teachers. We have a second group, the assessment data we get, that shows that the opportunities for academic growth and learning do not meet their needs. They don't recognize the brilliance that they have. And then we have a group of students who still receive an aligned experience because school was designed for them. And so when I think about why this is important, it's important because when we dug further into the data, what we saw is that often when learners were in these profile tracks, we then did a latent transition analysis. To what degree would that learner change, would their profile change across time? What we found in that data set, which collected over probably a decade, is that when learners were in a profile, that profile became pretty apparent by third grade. So by third grade, we would know what group of learners socially withdrew, had an aligned experience, academically withdrew. Here's the startling part, though. Those profiles were cemented by fifth grade. So no matter of the richness of things that were around them, the opportunities that were created, perhaps at the school level or the classroom level, their profile did not change before they graduated from school. So that is what Assessment for Good is about. It's about thinking about, one, can we trust the assessment data that is in front of us that only gives us those three profiles? Do you socially withdraw? Do you academically withdraw? Or you are aligned? That's not enough information. The second thing is that we have to think about what does it mean to design assessment systems that look at the brilliance of our learners, that recognize who they are. For me as a special educator, I love the assessment process because I define assessment as a way of getting to understand a learner's experience. They get to tell me who they are, and that is a very rich process. So when I think about what assessment is, it is that. Now, there are 5 things I'm going to share with you. So I'm the daughter of a reverend, and I'm sitting in front of a minister, Professor Gordon, and there are 2 things that struck fear or would give me promise, at the start of when she would get up to talk. The first was, I'm not going to be before you long. That was often a lie, but I promise I'm not going to be before you long. And the second was, how many points does she have to say today? And how long do I have to sit here in these scratchy stockings and this flowered dress that my grandmother would buy me? So I will not be before you long, and I only have 5 points I want to share with you today. So let's dig in. Assessment, so I think about this new paradigm for assessment. Assessment should be in the service of learning. About 8 weeks ago, I got the chance to talk with Professor Gordon, and I asked him about what is assessment in the service of learning. And there have been lots of people who have been thinking about this, and he's long since defined this through the Gordon Commission and other works. So this is my test to see if I can faithfully think through what he has talked about in the assessment of service and learning. And in this conversation, he talked about what he and Dr. Gordon would do with their 4 children, right? And so in this process, he talked about understanding how each of them were unique, how each of them were individuals, and they wanted to create learning experiences that matched who they were. And so Joanna, Jessica, Christopher, and Edmund each got a unique experience from them. They would arrange learning experiences that matched who they were and made sure that they supported each of their brilliance, I'm sure different, as different people. And so as we look at these pictures and we see this beautiful family, we think about this idea that assessment is in service of learning. Learning is not in service of assessment. Right now it is. Right now the assessment process dictates school funding, dictates accountability, dictates what you would teach, right? And assessment should be in service of that learning. And so what that looks like is thinking about, how do I understand what that learner can do? How do I then arrange instruction to meet their needs? And so the 5th point is assessment should be in the service of learning. Assessment should be in service of knowledge formation and generation. About 4 weeks ago, February 15th, some folks gathered in Charlotte, North Carolina, to think about this idea of what would asset-based formative assessment look like. And so here are a couple of things that came from that. And so when we think about it, one, the assessment is a process. It's not an event. It's a process. It's an exchange between an educator and a learner, between 2 learners, that allows us to understand the richness of their experience. It should reflect what learners choose to learn, what they're curious about. It should allow educators and learners to understand what is happening in that learning space. So I'm able to then change my instructional moves. I'm able to understand where I am growing, how I'm navigating my world. Here's the thing, learners know exactly what they need, and we don't necessarily need another assessment tool to tell us what they may or not know. And so when we think about what asset-based formative assessment is, it changes the directionality of the assessment process. As a special educator, I would often look for the assets that my learners had, because those kernels of knowledge allowed me then to bring that to in a novel experience. That's how I built a learning progression for learners. I didn't say, what don't you know how to do, and then let me figure it out. I said, let me start with where your strengths are, and then build a set of learning opportunities for you. And so because so many decisions get made in a classroom, a teacher makes upwards of 1,500 decisions a day in a classroom. Now, it took me a long time to figure out what I was going to wear today when I was packing my little bag. So 1,500 decisions is astronomical. And yet the assessment data they get comes at the end of the month, the end of the year, or long after that learner has left their classroom. And so we needed to become a lever that can build, that can give information at the speed of teaching and learning. And it should start with learners. And so number 4, the role of asset-based formative assessment, I think, is important for us to consider as we move forward. Assessment also has to be in service of transformation. I'm now realizing this type is really tiny, so I apologize. When I think about this idea of plausible futures and the speculative nature of our work and assessment for good, having a speculative lens is critical. What that means is that I'm looking into the future to determine what is it we want to see, what is our preferred future for our learners. Think about a young person who you may have in your life. What do you want them to be experiencing in 10 years? What opportunities do you want them to have? If we think in 10 years, we have a preferred future. I think about my daughter, although in 10 years she's going to be 28, so that's a whole nother issue. But in 10 years, I have a preferred, when she was young, I had a preferred future I had for her, and I had to arrange things in that order for her. Here's what happens, though. Often, we don't think about the future when it comes to the work that we have. And if we do, maybe 1 or 2 years in advance. And so when I think about this idea of plausible futures, there's a probable future. And that means, for instance, if we change very little, especially if we don't do this work together, probably little will change in 10 years. There are some possible futures, right? This idea of there's wildcard futures. When we were all sitting in our homes in 2019, we had no clue what was going to happen. There was a wild card that entered into our existence in 2020, right? That changed how we view the world. Several, actually, if we go back into the multiple things that converged in 2020. And so this idea that assessment has to be in service of transformation, but we have to think about what is it we want? What is the preferred future we truly want for our learners? And how can assessment be in service of that? The second is assessment in service of joy. When I think about being my first educational, when I was a teacher, was with young fives. Those were kids who were too young to go to school and kindergarten, and so you would have a class of, it wasn't preschool, but it was this idea you would still be in the school building. And when I close my eyes and I think about that environment, there was buzzing, talking, laughing, joking, and that was not just me, right? I'm not even talking about the learners there. We were discovering things together for the first time. If you asked a person today, a young person, about assessment, would they say it was ever in service of joy? So our goal, right? So our goal of assessment for good is that assessment is in service of joy. If a learner says that assessment process, or that thing you made me do, was the most fun thing in my day, that means that we have done our job. Learning should be joyful. And because assessment gives us great information, assessment should also be, when it's done right, should also be in service of joy. And so I invite you to think about that as we think about this new paradigm for assessment. And then number one, assessment should be in service of liberation. Our learners today do not exist, most of them do not exist in spaces in which they are liberated, their learning is liberated, their exchanges are liberated. And so when we think about assessment in service of liberation, I think about my daughter, who was always who still is, excited to show me what she knows. And that's what the assessment process is. And as those experiences begin to stack together, I begin to understand who she wants to be in the future. And she desires to be a liberated young woman. And so when I think about the processes that we create, I think about our partners in Durham, North Carolina, Village of Wisdom, who have the assessment survey that they've created that looks at racial justice and social justice and joy as a part of the experience. And it's created so that parents can identify experiences like that in their child's schools. I think of another partner of ours, Dr. Dina Simmons, who just created a new tool that focuses on those pedagogical exchanges in the classroom that are in service of liberation. I think of Throughline Learning in Providence, Rhode Island, that has the CRISP framework that looks at culturally responsive instruction and a survey with that. And so Assessment for Good thinks about these things deeply. Our goal is emancipation, is liberation. And so thank you so much for listening to this offer of what assessment should be. Our invitation is that you think about this alongside us. Think about how we think about the assessment process differently. To do this requires a couple of things. The first is, what new and emerging technologies will help us to get that? The last major change we saw in assessment was when it went from pencil and paper to computer. That was a long time ago. And really all we did was take the pencil and paper and just put it on a screen. So we are due for a revolution, a reimagination when it comes to the assessment and learning process. Thank you so much for your time today.
Is it still morning? No, it's 12:01. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I probably want control of my slides too, please. Thank you. Oh, well. First of all, I want to say thank you to Yolanda, to Temple, to Rachel for those wonderful presentations that you gave, because now you put me in the difficult position to kind of give a little bit of a review or commentary or add kind of like my little special sauce to it, so I appreciate that so much. And also being in the company of Dr. Gordon as well. It's good to see you. So there's a shadow on this too. Let me see. Okay, I created that word cloud. I love word clouds, very visual. And I created that one to take up the ideas that my colleagues have presented in their talks this morning. And it also helps me to think about the history of Yumi's 50 and the kind of work that has been happening within the Institute. And so that's almost like a little bit of a gift to add on to that other wonderful presentation we had from Barry this morning. So I want to be able to think about the work that my colleagues have presented on these ideas of Yolanda's work on racial literacy through archaeology of self, Rachel's work on the curriculum development with the Lenape, and then Temple's work on these ideas around future assessments and what does that look like. And I actually want to talk to you all about it through the work that I do as a teacher educator. And then I want to introduce you to one of my favorite persons, God rest her soul. Could you put the next slide up, please? So I went back to Bell Hooks' work, and I read her work as a doctoral student. I was in science education, so imagine this was not part of our curriculum at all. And so I was able to meet her as well. She came and did a talk on campus, and I was like, who is this? Her work just resonated with me. And I read the book, and I was like, oh my goodness, she's talking to me. I thought she was really talking to me. And so a couple of summers ago, I got together students in mathematics, science curriculum, and we reread that book. And I took the initial text that I had with all my notes and markings in the margin and was like, she is still relevant. And so I thought, as the discussant for this session, I said, I've got to go back to Bell and pull out something to be able to pull all of the ideas together, and how appropriate it was. She's still very relevant. So any radical pedagogy must insist that everyone's presence is acknowledged. That insistence cannot be simply stated. It has to be demonstrated through pedagogical practices. To begin, the professor, and I inserted the teacher, must genuinely value everyone's presence. So then, as I understand this particular quote, this idea around presence has to be acknowledged if we take up radical pedagogy. We must insist, meaning we must fight, for ways of teaching, learning, and assessment, because it's not simple. And to insist on doing these things differently and radically, then you are truly and genuinely valuing every student that's in your classroom. You have to be able to see their full identities, see them as whole persons, from the youngest of our learners to the eldest of our learners. So if you open spaces for teaching, learning, curriculum, and assessment, then everyone must be included, and we heard that across the panel. Otherwise, you risk transformative and radical learning for everyone, including yourself. Then I have a set of questions to be able to think about, and my colleagues as well presented these questions. What is teaching? What is learning? What is curriculum? What is assessment? And these are not rhetorical questions. These are questions we have to begin to ask ourselves, and also to be able to answer them. So then, as my work, as I think about my work as a teacher educator, to be able to answer these questions, we have an opportunity to reimagine a future, as Temple said, a future about teaching, learning, curriculum, and assessment that is not the traditional version that we probably grew up with, and even some of us are practicing in our classrooms, or things that we even observe in schools. So I am obligated to prepare future teacher educators. That's the work that I've taken on. and those who will stand in similar teacher education spaces or school spaces to do the work that I'm doing or the work that any of my colleagues are doing. So I challenged them to think about, what is your radical pedagogy? I create spaces to discuss the impact of race and racism in educational biographies that students write. They share narratives and excerpts of their lives and their experiences in schools and with young people. And then I prepare them to talk about the racial literacy, to go through what my colleague has mentioned to talk about. So in a white-dominated society, most of us have received little or no education and opportunity to talk about the impact of race and racism in education, and we don't feel prepared to talk about it. We don't feel prepared to think critically about these and have open discussions. We often do not question or dig deep and excavate and inquire about our education and what it has taught us and what it has not taught us in the place of what Rachel's work. We do not inquire of the curriculum, the erasure of peoples and knowledges, and we do not question the impact and the power of data and what data is used for and how the results can be twisted in certain ways. Of course, we have personal experiences. However, this is not enough to contend with the years of explicit and implicit bias, structural racism, and everything that has contributed to our misunderstandings of who we are and the young people that are in our classrooms, and even our outlook on education. So here we are. We have to engage in these questions about race and racism, about pedagogy, about curriculum. And then how do we do that? How do we engage in these kinds of conversations, such as forums like this? These conversations must also include how we grapple with it, how we think about our sense of agency, our power and our privilege, and even how we acknowledge the young people that are in our classrooms and the communities they come from. So in the presentations by our panels, they offer me things to think about, which I also want you to think about and to consider. So in 3 broad areas, this is what I want you to think about as I thought about it. First, consider teacher education. What kinds of experiences should we offer our teacher candidates? How am I preparing future teacher educators with the kinds of experiences they need to change schools, to enact empowering policies and practices, and then to transform the systems in which they are working for larger educational goals? How do I provide a future thinking vision through teaching, learning, curriculum, and assessment in my role as a teacher educator? What about you? How are you supporting those who have the vision as well and doing this kind of work? Secondly, consider the curriculum. What does transformative, radical curriculum look like to you? So for me, how am I challenging the policies on what is taught in teacher education? Content-specific classes, even in the content that I have in terms of science. How am I being inclusive of indigenous knowledges, narratives, and other perspectives? And then I'm asking you, and for me too, how are we rewriting the standard curriculum and supporting those who are doing this kind of work? Third, let's consider assessment. What is the role of assessments, which Timble did tell us about from her talk? So then how am I assessing my teacher candidates and my future teacher educators? How are we using data, and sometimes for nefarious reasons, right? Such as interrogating teacher licensing testing that often serves as a gatekeeper for our teachers of color. What are ways of assessing our teacher candidates and teacher candidates of color for their entry into the profession, and also for their retention in the profession? So on a daily basis in our classrooms, white children are taught that they are white, and this comes through in the curriculum that is taught that prioritizes Western ways of knowing and Eurocentric perspectives, and in classroom practices that incorporate their mainstream experiences and interactions over others. While teaching in these ways, teachers also create and maintain this kind of educational distance, is what I call it, between who the children are and what you're learning in the classroom. So then we have to be able to think about our students' identities as well as our teachers' identities as part of the curriculum. Curriculum reforms have failed to override the influences of what students and teachers bring into the classroom, such as gender, religion, race, and ethnicity. Schooling and the school curriculum are generally reproductive. It is active in reproducing the economic and cultural imbalances upon which the society has been built, namely the white dominant views of teaching, learning, and assessment. So then we think about curriculum has the ability to recreate, and we know that. So then how are we going in the opposite direction. Zeus Leonardo and W. Norton Grubbs have stated about curriculum, the curriculum project becomes a racial project. And I think this is what we often forget about, that it is embedded within ideas of thinking about race and racism. So our traditional white norm curriculum is not based on the experiences of African American children and their communities and other social and ethnic groups. So there are missions, and we learned that from the panelists as well. But how do we think about transforming all of this as we think about a transformative curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment? So Yolanda's work is archaeology of self transformed. Rachel's work is the Lenape curriculum transformed. Temple's work is assessment transformed. We see the radical possibilities through their work, which gives us permission to make changes as well. So I'm asking you, how do we counter erasure of self by doing the work of deep excavation of ourselves? How do we counter erasure in a collaborative community of curriculum development and design? And then how do we counter ways of assessment so that we can learn more about the assessment process and what we learn from it? My work is a continual reflection of what I do and how I can do it better. In the form of the curriculum that I choose in teacher education or even in my science education classes, the pedagogies that I practice across all of them, and in the forms of assessment that I develop for students and teachers' racial literacy development. And I'm also trying to position them in places where they can do the same. So we have an enormous responsibility and the urgency for being able to transform our pre-K-12 and higher education systems would truly allow us to create spaces for children to flourish, to dream, and to grow. We want them to be able to dream big dreams, just like Yolanda said of her work. We want them to be able to think about themselves embedded within the curriculum, as we saw that in Rachel's work. And we all want to be able to have multiple kinds of futures that Temple talked about. So as I started, I'm going to end with another Bell Hooks quote, so we can go to the next slide. So this one talks about critical reflection. And I think critical reflection is a requirement if we are to engage in radical transformation of the self, the curriculum, and pedagogy and assessment. So she says, passionately insisting that no matter what one's class, race, gender, or social standing is, I shared my beliefs that without the capacity to think critically about ourselves and our lives, none of us would be able to move forward to change and to grow. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your framing and your articulation of the work. I'm thinking, and I want to open this up to questions from the audience because I'm a very blunt instrument. But I'm thinking about a lecture I gave here maybe years back, right? And my dear friend and colleague Carl Hart was in here, and I don't know what he might have been on at the time, if you know Carl. But one of the questions that he asked I thought was so important and crucial. You got what I'm talking about, right? One of the things that I did was I presented kind of these asset-based models and these suppositions, but I hadn't quite articulated why there was a need for a shift or a radical intervention. And I really appreciate Dr. Mensah in helping us talk about the existence of white supremacy and these racial narratives and framings and groundings that we are resisting against, that each of you all, so beautifully talked about, but I thought it was so important in this discussant portion to say what we are fighting is this, pervasive white supremacist structure that is attempting to grind us, right? My question is this. I grew up in many different places. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, in high school in Texas, which was horrible, right? Horrible because of its racism. And one of the things that I think about is that I went to great schools. I went to some private schools and all that kind of stuff, but my mom put me in the Arlington Public School District when I was a junior and senior in high school and says, you got to deal and figure out how to swim, brother. And I was like, this is the worst. It's the worst. And I was conditioned in many ways. Still, I see myself thinking in this conditioned way of having grown up in Texas, right? So excuse me, again, I'm a blunt instrument here. What you all, each of you, offer for us is this progressive view of teaching, learning, assessing, knowing what is a learner, what is a teacher, what is assessment. Assessments for joy, come on, man, for real? Right? I mean that is so important to recognize. But I'm curious, we all in some capacity, I presume, have been targets of this white supremacist framework that we are pushing and resisting against. And so often the targets are the ones who are charged with carrying this weight. What is the responsibility of those who practice? And I think of Toni Morrison. I also think when you started talking about Bell Hooks, I was thinking about her as we were speaking here in a killing rage and how angry I am that I've been in these spaces. But I think of Toni Morrison, and we know that her interview had gone viral with Charlie Rose, where he asks, "What do you think about racism?" She said, "This is the wrong question. What do you think about it? You're practicing it." So what is it that we charge those folks who are still pushing this white supremacist paradigm upon us? What do we charge them to do?
What a brilliant, beautiful question. And I have to always go back to a black woman, because the work that I do around racial literacy, the answers have always been there. The joy has always been there. The looking at the indigeneity of who we are has always been there. Dr. Mensah, you embody what Fannie Jackson Coppin, what Mary McLeod Bethune, women, black women who created schools at a time when we were still told that we were not intellectually capable to learn. Sister Clara Muhammad, you think about the schools that she created for the children in the Nation of Islam, all centered on the humanity, right, of children. So first I want to just say that that is my model and my lesson, and it took me a while to get there because of the violence and the erasure and the, really, we didn't know we were being damaged, but the damage that was happening in the K-12 settings. So I often write with, Goldie Muhammad and others, and we talk about, look at what a black woman has created. Look at those systems that have been created at a time, often in deep segregation, where black children were learning to thrive. And so I think in our teacher education programs, we have to flip who we're studying. We have to flip Vygotsky, appreciate, flip Dewey, I know where we are. We have to flip, right, some of these folks and look at those we are serving who knew and understood how to serve them. That is in the black print, not blueprint. I want to give it up for black gays, and that is often black men, yes, but black women who created curriculum for black children. That is what needs to be studied in teacher education programs. That is what needs to be centered in professional learning spaces, because the teachers who are serving our children, they're looking at the models that are not meant for us.
So how do we get white folk to do that?
Well, we have the teacher education programs. Well, first of all, I always have hope, and I'll pass it to my sisters. I have enduring hope and that people want to do the right thing, or else I couldn't do this work. I have to want to believe that it is something in the spirit of a human being once they realize what they're doing wrong. When they're serving children, I'm not talking about other professions, in education, that they would want to have a shift. We have to, at the teacher education level, those of the white folk who are in power at the table, you have to know when to be silent and invite others in. It's a heart shift, it's a heart and a mind shift. So I guess what I'm asking for is the enduring hope in humanity, and those who open their eyes and see it, they just don't remain silent, and they make a move forward. But you have to have professional learning. If you're a teacher in a school, the leadership, it's an ecosystem. Mark Gooden is here, culturally responsive leadership. It's all of that. Philip Smith, I'm gonna pass the mic. The whole system needs to be changed and shifted in a new direction. That's how we begin.
Thank you.
You know, it makes me think about, you know, when you said, well, how do we get them to do that? And it goes back to your question, I think also with Belle's question around the critical part of it. You have to think. We have to make people think differently. I remember a study that I did years ago here where I did a book club with my pre-service elementary students. And part of it was asking them questions to read a text that they thought, like, why are we reading a multicultural text in a science methods class? And that's a beautiful question. You know, it's like, because I need for you to know the connections between multiculturalism and science and schools and teaching and learning. And part of that came out, many of the students said, you forced me to think about it. And I think that's what we have to do. It's like we don't have time for the niceties anymore. Mm-hmm. We have to start forcing people to think about difficult and challenging questions and the things that are going on, because our children it's an investment of our children. They're going to continue to go through the educational system, one teacher at a time. But what happens when they get into one teacher's classroom that's totally different? It can make a difference in their life trajectory. And so I'm at the point where I have to get my students like, I'm gonna force you to think about this. I'm gonna force you to talk about this because it's just that important for the future of our children. And we have to do that. We have to kind of, like you said, like go, Uncle Jimmy, go for broke. We have to go for those things that are gonna be hard and challenging for us, but know on the other end it's for your good. It's like you're eating your vegetables. You know they're good for you. So it's like, and so I'm telling them that I know this is going to be hard for you to talk about these issues. I know that. I understand it is, but we still got to do it. We just have to do it. And I think when we start to think about that as that transformative pedagogy, transformative conversations that we have in classrooms, we have to do it, and not taking excuses for it. And eventually they'll come along, or not, but eventually we hope, again, with that radical hope, we hope that they will come along with it because it's the impact in the future of the children that we have in our classrooms.
Thank you for that. And I'll ask for people that might have questions if they can proceed to the mic now. I want to ask one more question just because I loved hearing you all in your different ways say it. And I want to hear it again because you've outlined it for us. But can you talk about the importance of looking at and leaning into identity? This idea of knowing and appreciating, respecting the learner as well as the teacher. I love Dr. Sealey-Ruiz, who began talking about loving the people we are in service to, right? The community we are in service to. But why is it important to know and to be tapped in authentic ways, right? Professor has talked before about this idea of authentic engagement. Why is that so important in terms of how it is that we're thinking about things radically and transformatively?
Yeah, I'll start, although this will probably be incomplete. Identity for me is about connection, right? So at Assessment for Good, we focus on psychosocial skills, and of those, some of those may be engagement and belonging and social development. But the way we do that is through the ways in which we identify within ourselves, like who we are, and then how we find those points of connection in others. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's why it's so important. And so when a learner says, you know, I love my identity as a disabled learner, as a neurodivergent girl, sorry, that's my reminder to take my medication. I'm that age where things have to ding for me to take my medication. That's why it's important, because that connection, I mean, we focus on 8 to 13, that transition from 8 years to 13 years old. And so much is happening as learners discover who they are. They want to connect. They want to belong. They want to engage in ways that are authentic, that affirm who they are. They want to see confirmation in the environments around them at home, at school, and in their communities that affirm and connect to who they are. So that's why I think it's so important as a starting point to this answer.
Rachel? I didn't mean to force it on you.
I think it's really important for students to think about the system that they're in, and for teachers to think about being in a settler system. I don't think that you can show up. You know, we had a lot of the phase of anti-racist book clubs in 2020. But without thinking about systemic racism, how are you going to go to an anti-racist book club? Right? So I think really similarly in teacher education, the settler identity and settler colonization in the US needs to be considered. Usually colonization is something that's not talked about as happening here in the United States. So lots of teachers come to the work saying, oh, I know about colonialism and that's in Africa. Or I know about colonialism and that was what the US did in the Philippines. Not many people come to the space of teaching and say, I know about settler colonialism and that's what's happening here and is still happening here. And without that understanding, like there's this rush to everyone wants to be a decolonial teacher. And I think much like you can't go to an anti-racist book club without understanding systemic racism, you can't say you're going to decolonize until you first understand we are in a system that is ongoing, not back in the days of Manifest Destiny, but is ongoing now in the United States. And so for me, I think for teachers and for students to understand that level of identity is critical if you ever want to get to decolonization. And it's harder work because like everyone wants to decolonize. Like so many teachers are like, just quick, like let's tell me how to decolonize. And it's like, well, but you don't even understand that system.
Yeah.
So how are you going to push against it when you don't get the system that you're in? So I think that learning, that historical literacy comes first.
And thank you so much for that. That's in connecting the dots for me personally. I remember seeing in my social studies book that American Progress illustration, and that gave me that killing rage. I was like, what the hell? That's what this is? And you think about, exactly, with the little angel, but the little angel, I'm like, God, dog. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going through it. Can we get questions from the audience now? Again, we have microphones right here if you'd care to. Yeah, please.
Really, it's not a question. I was really debating if I should speak or not. But I have to. It's just a question, and then, no, I will speak first. When we're talking about colonization, and you are mentioning we need to know them, the colonizers, is that? Really, it's not about them. We need to learn about ourselves. Because all of us, the colonizers and us, are influenced by habits, okay? And those are unconscious behaviors. It's nobody's fault. And here we are fighting. We don't need to fight. We need to go within, identify what is holding us back, and then move to the next step. When I came here, I was a fighter. And as I did an implementation and I was very successful, I learned that I was using organizational theory. I didn't know that at that time. But when I came here, thanks to Dr. Gordon, I came here to study what the colonizer is using to control us. And that is organization theory. It's everywhere. Okay? And based on that, I realized, because DiMaggio states that it's not against the system or the organization. The work that we need to do is work with the people, because people are the ones who are the organization. We don't fight the system. We help the people to have the mindset In that way, together, we change whatever this means, because we are in a system where the goals were set up before we show up. You understand that, right? And that is what we are seeing now. But we are here, and we can change them without fighting. Because when we fight, we feed what we don't want, and we don't see it. You see, when you dance, you need that tension. You see? It's physics. If we fight, we will not change anything. We need to just stop, reflect, and see whatever it is that we need to see, because we don't see it. In neuroscience, it states that 95 to 98% of what we do, we don't see it. Then when we talk about all this work, maybe it's just 2 to 5% we are addressing, but we are missing the 98%. Then I just wanted to, because when we say we need to fight the system, no, because I had to speak up, because we have been fighting forever and nothing has changed. And the second point, and you don't need to answer, but what is the assessment of your work? How are you closing the achievement gap? Because I don't see a conversation about it. Because it's nice talking, all this, great. But when you are doing that work, are you measuring how we are closing the achievement gap? I don't know, but it's just a thought, you know? And thank you for your work.
Thank you. Let me ask this before you all lean in. I wonder if we might, two things. I wonder if we might do both and, right? If we might fight, because I do still think we have to fight, and then figure out nuanced and strategic ways that we are fighting and we're pushing against. Because I think that when we're talking about, anytime we're talking about radical or transformative change, there is tension there, obviously, and that is a fight, but it is a strategic leaning in. But I'm thoughtful and appreciate the comment. I was shared that I teach at Morehouse, and I was on a panel with Ambassador Andrew Young once, right? And Ambassador Young was like, David, my father told me never to fight. You know, when you fight, your adrenaline runs and you can't really do what you need to do. And I was like, Ambassador Young, he's like, you gotta fight me. And I said, well, you're actually contradicting what it is you're saying, but my mother did not raise me, Ambassador Young, to be up here on stage and argue with Ambassador Young, right? I can't do that. But I do think that it's important to push back and to look at the strategic ways that fighting is necessary, because as you all are talking, you're talking about radically changing and transforming ideas that influence policy, right? And that is fighting a system. But then I also think of DeSantis, I think about the 45th President of the United States, and it is very important that we draw lines in the sand and resist these master narratives and these big lies and these stock stories, right, that have been presented to us for so very long, because there's an opportunity for us to engage in radical change there. There was a question around closing the achievement gap as well, which I see your work leaning into, but if anybody wanted to speak specifically to that, please.
No, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Rice, and thank you, Sister, where did she go? For everything that you shared. The only comment I want to make is the language that we use, and understanding that that is also, we are so entrenched in the colonizer's mindset that we have to even, and I do believe it's both, we have to fight. And if I look at the legacy of my ancestors from the very beginning, it was a fight, because if they didn't, the status quo would just happen. And so that fighting, whether it's spiritual fighting or fighting a system or actually fighting and putting their lives and bodies on the line, it was an interruption. And when you share that, you know, we've been fighting all this time and look at where we are, I think if we had not been fighting, it would be really worse. Because those moments of fighting in various forms have been interruptions and ways of saying, I am human, you will see me, this system can just not go on like this. And in terms of the opportunity gap, I want to bring in Richard Milner, Dr. Richard Milner and Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, incredible scholars who give us language, right? As we're growing and changing, we're learning. And so achievement gap is not our language. There's never been an achievement gap among us, Dr. Gordon, and the years that he studied, and scholars who know the genius of children, Baba Asa Hilliard and many. It has always been opportunity gaps. And what Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings actually frames it beautiful in terms of indigenous students as well as black students, it has been an education debt. It is actually a debt that is owed and no one is paying. So I just wanted to share that about, as we talk with each other, if you had not brought up those things, we wouldn't be able to have this moment now and to continually challenge ourselves and understand it's not one way. It can be both and. Three things can be true at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. Next question, please.
Good afternoon to each of you. Honoring Dr. Gordon, being grateful to be in your presence and the presence of all of you scholars and researchers and doctors and so forth, all the educators here. I said that in that way because I'm a former classroom teacher, over 20 years teaching middle school mathematics in a low-income community, and I still am a daughter of that community. So I was one of those young children that the village, the community raised up and made sure that I had opportunity and experiences that we are still looking at today. And I am a product of the discussions that we hear even today. And I am a graduate of Wilberforce University, which is this historic HBCU founded by freed slaves. So as a student there, when I did attend, leaving out the years, it was everything about making us the people we have become today, meaning the students. So I wanted to just, I have a whole lot inside of me, and I'm so honored to be present, to be able to just listen and be a student. And I learned that educators are lifelong learners. And I asked to be approved to attend today from work, because this meant a lot to me, to be under you and just be at the feet of the scholars who's doing the work. But I do have a question because of a lot of what I said. When we look at what you all mentioned, I think the last question at the end of the panel discussion was, how do we cause the change? How do we, in regards to teacher education, how do we, I don't want to know the term, but how do we get teachers to teach or be, how do we create a radical, not a radical, how do we create a racial literate school community? Would that work? Or maybe I need a little more with that. But the point is, how do we teach teachers to teach with the racial foundation? And you all will correct me on how to ask that question. But what I wanted to ask, in my years of teaching, whether it was a new academic thought, a process, an idea, a concept, a standard. As a math teacher, we would dismiss school in June, the end of the school year, and if there was something pressing, a standard that needed to be revisited, a new concept, a new a style of teaching, whatever it was, you can go from June, dismiss the school, close out the school year, and start the new year, school year, a couple of months later, and everything would stop, and we were forced to teach this new curriculum, this new idea, this new concept, this new way of teaching and learning overnight. So my question is, why is it difficult for us to bring this process in, this racial literate concept? Why is it a challenge there? And I'm wondering, is it a new curriculum that needs to be introduced, or is it a new teacher education, or new standards that need to be in place? Certainly we know legislation drives it all, but we have to stop and think about it. Are we asking, as an educator, as an institution for educators, do you need to change the curriculum? Do you need to change the standards? Or do you need to change legislation?
Yes.
So that's my big question. I don't know how I can pull it all together in that way, but I'm finding it, this big talk, and I'm a part of some groups that are doing the Black History curriculum and all these different things, but everybody is saying, and I'm just listening, I don't know the root behind it from the scholarly level, from the research level, but why is that a big question? How do we educate educators to educate our students in this subject area when they've done it all through my entire 20 years of teaching in 3 months? Okay, I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. Let me say first, thank you so much for being here and for sharing with us. And before our scholars lean in, let me say, because I'm keen on this idea of our language, you're not under anyone here. You're with us. Clearly, you've demonstrated that. So I want to make sure that we say that. But yes, please.
Yeah, so I know we are over time. I think we are.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are. I let it go. I'm sorry, you guys. It's on me.
So I will, as you know, the person who talked about assessment, I will answer the question and I will fill in the bubble sheet that says E, all of the above. Mm-hmm. We need it all. Right now, the way we answer that is there's too much junk in front of our educators that they are forced to teach based upon the decisions that were made, often not even in their own district. And so the way we answer that is by creating new tools that center the things that we've talked about today and get them in front of educators, in front of learners, and the learning that happens outside of that school building in homes and in communities. So that's how we answer the question, but I believe it's all of the things that you've mentioned. It's not one or the other, we'll need it all.
I just want to give one quick example, because I work with teachers and say, what are you teaching currently, like your curriculum, and then work with that particular curriculum to revise it and transform it. But here's one example that I tell teachers. They tell you to teach the standards. They don't tell you how. And so one example that I have, like I was teaching a genetics lesson in high school, and I use this example often with teachers as the example. So they tell you to teach, the genetics and all of that. So, but they never tell you, like, back to the identity question. I have students bring in pictures of their families and talk about the families, and even children who have been adopted, that's your family. And so you bring pictures in and you look at yourselves and you say, oh, I got eyes like my dad, I got eyes like my granddad. That's a genetics lesson. I'm still teaching the standard, but they don't tell me how to do it. And so that's what you have to do, is like look at what they tell you to teach and come up with these creative ways that would be more inclusive of the children, their histories, thinking about the history of people's knowledges, ways of thinking. You bring that into the curriculum, and you still would have covered the standard. And whatever children are interested in as well, what are they interested in? What do they want to know? And I've taught this genetics lesson with kindergartners all the way up to high school and college. So it's a standard. You just figure out how to get it in there. Yeah.
So let me, I'm sorry, yeah. Sorry, hold on, Ezekiel.
Sorry. I was going to say, we know from research in this field of Indigenous education that it's policy that helps and supports. So we have examples from Washington State, Montana, Oregon State, where when there's a policy that comes with funding to fund tribal nations, supporting good curriculum development, and then making it a requirement that before teachers are certified, they learn this knowledge, that it works. Yeah. Like, we now have research that shows these new baby policies that were baby policies a decade ago, they've been in existence, they work. So it's policy. And then I would say teachers are hungry for this. We don't have a PD that we don't fill. here at TC when we talk about this curriculum. Like, so teachers are hungry for it, but I think they're learning how to sneak around the standards because we don't have standards on this. So, but
So with that, I want to thank you all for being here today, but I want to thank you all, Dr. Lovelace, Dr. Sealey-Ruiz, Dr. Talbert, Dr. Mensah. And I think I really want to thank you all. Certainly you all talk about radical and transformative work, but I want to thank you for the radical and transformative work that you've done with loving yourselves enough to put forward change, because that really is illustrated here. And I think that has everything to do with how it is that we can kind of push forward. So with that, I'll say thank you, Yumi, thank you, Doc.
Yeah. So, wow, and wow. This panel has been incredibly both energizing, intellectually engaging, and just really, really thought-provoking, and pushing the boundaries, pushing us to really think hard about issues. I'm going to shut up, because I know some of us are hungry. Probably all of us are hungry. And I think there's a lot that has been talked about here that's been engaged, that's been addressed, and many other questions that I'm sure many others in the audience have that we could digest on over some lunch. I want to remind folk that there is the timeline that is in Everett Hall to, as you go and have your lunch, to also check out the timeline. But I'm going to stop on this and let you all go have something to eat, and we'll come back at 1:30. I'm sorry, that's right. Lunch is in Everett Hall. Please forgive me. Yeah, that's right.
Taking my time, but no, it's good to see you. I remember, yeah. So we created, this was created here. Okay. The small fall initiative, the youth education through sport. Amazing. I remember from the youth education. Yeah, no, I remember, yes. Still doing it. I love it. It's just in the transition to a social enterprise. So that's the only way we can provide. Traditional knowledge that don't come. No, not yet.